Victor Granger's riders came down the ridge at noon on a Tuesday, and they didn't knock. They kicked the door open on old Harlan Doyle's cabin like the wood owed them something, dragged the 70-year-old man out by his collar while his dog barked itself hoarse, and tossed his belongings into the snow like they were emptying a trash barrel. Harlan had lived on that land for 41 years, built the cabin with his own hands, buried his wife under the oak tree out back. Victor's men didn't look at the grave once. "You had your warning," the lead rider said, and that was all the explanation Harlan got. If that makes your blood boil, good. It should. This is the story of what happened next. Of a young woman with almost nothing who opened her door to strangers in a blizzard. Of a quiet cowboy who was hiding more than anyone guessed. And of the moment one small act of human decency set off a chain of events that nobody on that mountain saw coming. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or left out in the cold, stay with me. Hit that like button before we go any further, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because the story we're telling next will leave you just as breathless. Now, let's go back to the night the blizzard came in, and two strangers knocked on Ivy Rowan's door. The snow started falling around 3 in the afternoon, which didn't concern Ivy Rowan much at first. She had seen plenty of November storms roll in off the upper ridges. They usually blew hard for an hour, dropped 4 or 5 inches, and moved on before midnight. She'd already brought the 2 goats in from the small pen beside the barn, stacked the remaining firewood under the overhang so it wouldn't get buried, and dragged her grandfather's old weather-cracked door shut against the draft coming through the north-facing gap in the cabin wall. She'd been meaning to stuff rags into that gap since September. She still hadn't done it. By 4 o'clock, the sky had turned the color of a tin pot, and the snow wasn't slowing down. By 5, she could barely see the barn from the kitchen window. Ivy stood at the glass with her arms crossed and watched the white swallow the yard, and she ran through the numbers the way she always did when anxiety crept up on her, involuntarily. Like a reflex, she couldn't stop. 2 weeks of oats left, half a sack of dried beans, 6 potatoes, maybe 7 if she counted the small one she'd been putting off because it had gone soft on one side. A quarter wheel of hard cheese her neighbor Ada Pruitt had given her 3 weeks ago. The cheese was almost gone. She was 23 years old and she had been alone on this mountain for 8 months. Her grandfather, Holt Rowan, had died in late March, quietly, in the same chair he'd sat in for 40 years, with his boots still on because he'd never gotten around to taking them off after dinner. He hadn't been sick exactly. He'd just been old and tired and ready. She'd found him in the morning and she'd cried for 2 days, and then she'd gotten up and started figuring out what came next. What came next was harder than she'd expected. Holt had left her the cabin and the land, 31 acres of mountain slope, a small meadow, the barn, and a creek that ran cold and clear from April through October before it went thin and half-frozen in the winter. He'd also left her a tangle of debts she hadn't known about. A loan against the property taken out 4 years ago when a late frost killed the vegetable crop, and Holt had needed to buy feed for the livestock. Interest that had compounded quietly while Ivy was away in the valley working as a seamstress to send money home. A second, smaller debt she still didn't fully understand, something involving a promissory note and a man named Granger, whose name she'd seen once on a piece of paper, and then again at the bottom of a letter she'd found tucked behind the loose brick in the chimney. She hadn't told anyone about that letter. She wasn't sure yet what it meant. What she knew was that she was behind, that the margins were razor thin, and that one bad winter could take everything her grandfather had spent 4 decades building. So she watched the snow pile up, and she calculated, and she told herself she'd gotten through hard things before. Then she heard the horse. She almost missed it. The wind had picked up and was pushing hard against the north wall, rattling the single glass pane in the bedroom window. But there was something underneath the noise that didn't belong. A heavy, labored sound. She pressed her ear toward the door. The knock came a moment later, 3 times. Hard, like whoever was on the other side had already hesitated once and decided not to do it again. Ivy picked up the iron poker from beside the fireplace before she moved toward the door. She wasn't ashamed of that. She was a young woman alone in an isolated cabin in a blizzard, and she had no illusions about the world being full of harmless people. She held the poker low, not in a threatening way, just in a way that meant she hadn't forgotten it was there. She opened the door. The man on her porch was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy canvas coat that had probably been waterproof once and wasn't anymore. His hat was crusted with snow and his face was windburned, jaw set hard in the particular way people set their jaws when they're running low on warmth and dignity and don't want to ask for either. His eyes were dark, steady, and tired. And pressed against his left side, one small arm wrapped tight around the man's leg, was a little boy. The child couldn't have been more than 5, maybe 6. He was wearing an adult's wool scarf wrapped around him so many times that only his face showed, and his eyes were enormous, dark brown like the man's, round with cold and exhaustion, and something else that Ivy couldn't name right away. She named it later, after she'd had more time to think. It was the look of a child who had learned very recently not to expect things to go well. The man spoke first. His voice was low, steady, controlled in the way of someone who had worked hard to make it so. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "The horse is spent and I can't push on in this. I just need one night out of the cold for my boy. I can sleep in the barn if you have one." Ivy looked at him, then at the child, then at the darkness behind them, which was no longer darkness but a solid wall of moving white. "The barn roof has 2 broken sections," she said. "You'd freeze in the barn. Then I'd be grateful for a corner of the porch. The porch has a gap in the rail. Wind comes straight through." Something in his face shifted. Not pleading. She could see he wasn't built for pleading. Something more honest than that. He glanced down at the boy for just a moment, then back at her. "I don't have a better option," he said flatly. "I wouldn't be knocking if I did." It wasn't a smooth line. It wasn't charming or calculated. It was just a man telling her the truth because the truth was what the situation required. And Ivy had spent enough time around people who dressed their needs up in prettier words than they deserved to recognize the difference. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Both of you." The man hesitated, like he was checking whether she meant it, and then he moved inside, bringing the cold with him. The boy came with him, still attached to his leg, and Ivy shut the door against the storm and stood for a moment in her own kitchen, feeling the sudden presence of other people in a space that had held only her for 8 months. It was strange, stranger than she expected it to feel. "I'm Cole," the man said. He didn't offer a last name. "Ivy," she said. He nodded toward the boy. "This is Eli." The child looked up at her with those enormous dark eyes, and Ivy did the only thing that came naturally. She crouched down to his level. "Are you hungry, Eli?" He didn't answer out loud. He just gave a single, very serious nod, like the question deserved careful consideration before he committed to a response. Ivy almost smiled. She didn't quite. "Come sit by the fire," she said. "We'll get you warmed up." She fed them what she had. There wasn't much. She heated the bean soup she'd made that morning and added water to stretch it, cut the last significant portion of the hard cheese into 3 equal pieces, and put cornbread on the iron plate over the fire. Cole watched her work with a quiet attention that she noticed but didn't comment on. He didn't offer to help until he saw her struggling to lift the heavy pot with her left hand. She'd strained that wrist 2 weeks ago, dragging a fence post, and it still wasn't right. And then he simply said, "Let me," and lifted it without further comment. He didn't make it a point, didn't expect thanks, just moved the pot and stepped back. Eli ate with the focused determination of a child who had been genuinely cold and genuinely hungry and was taking the situation seriously. He didn't spill anything. He said please. When Ivy offered him a second piece of cornbread, said thank you after she gave it to him. She'd expected a child that young to be louder, more demanding. He was neither. "He's quiet," she said to Cole, while the boy was occupied with his food. Cole was quiet for a moment before he answered. "He's been through a hard month," he said, and his voice carried something layered and careful that Ivy understood meant she'd reached the edge of what he was willing to share. She didn't push. After dinner, Cole laid out his bedroll on the floor near the fire. He'd refused the offer of Holt's old chair, not from false modesty, but with the matter-of-fact reasoning that the chair looked like it would be harder to sleep in than the floor, and Eli curled up beside him with the uncomplicated trust of a child who believed entirely that whatever happened next, his father would manage it. Cole pulled a worn wool blanket over the boy and sat for a moment watching him fall asleep. Ivy was at the table, mending a tear in her work coat under the lamp, half watching. She told herself she wasn't watching, she was mending. "The storm's not breaking tonight," Cole said. He wasn't looking at her. He was still watching Eli. I know, she said. You should try to sleep. Both of you have had a hard day. Miss Rowan. She looked up. I don't make a habit of accepting charity, he said. I want you to know that. And when the weather clears, I'll pay you what I can before we leave. You don't need to pay me. I know I don't need to. His voice was flat, steady. I intend to anyway. She studied him a moment. He was looking at her now. In the firelight, his face was difficult to read, not because it was closed off exactly, but because whatever was moving under the surface was moving slowly and with a great deal of weight behind it. All right, she said. She went back to her mending. He lay down beside his son, and the storm kept moving over the mountain in great slow waves that made the walls flex and the chimney moan. And for the first time in 8 months, Ivy Rowan's cabin didn't feel completely empty. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. The storm had not broken by morning. Ivy woke before light, which was her habit, and built the fire back up from coals and started the water for coffee before she registered that Cole was already awake. He was at the far end of the room, sitting on an overturned crate near the window, watching the dark. He had a stillness about him that she noticed again now, not the stillness of a man relaxed, but the stillness of a man who was always paying attention, who rested his body while keeping some other part of himself continuously on watch. You didn't sleep much, she said. I sleep light, he said. It wasn't an explanation, just a fact. She poured water into the pot and said, There's something you're not telling me. He looked at her. You've got that look, she said, like you're expecting company you haven't invited. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. He stood up from the crate and came to stand at the other side of the table. He was taller than she'd remembered from last night. She'd been too focused on Eli to fully register how much space he took up. I'm not going to bring trouble to your door, he said. That's not what I asked. No, he agreed. It isn't. Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind was still pushing hard, driving snow against the window glass in long, hissing sheets. You're running from someone, she said. I'm not running, he said carefully, and she could hear that he meant the word precisely. I walked away from something. There's a difference. The something is following you. He looked at the window. I believe so, he said. Yes. Ivy absorbed this. She turned back to the fire and added another log and watched the sparks crawl upward. Is whatever you walked away from, is it dangerous? She asked. Not to you, he said. Not if I'm gone before it catches up. She nodded slowly, turned around to face him. Then we'd better hope this storm passes fast, she said. And because there was nothing more to say about it, not yet, not this morning, she reached past him to get the coffee cups off the shelf, and the subject was dropped, and she poured the coffee, and they sat across the table from each other while Eli slept on, and the storm pressed down on the mountain like a great cold hand refusing to lift. He kept his word about not being idle. By mid-morning, when it became clear the storm was settling in for a second full day, Cole had taken stock of what needed doing around the place, with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing a situation and moving directly to the work. He didn't ask permission. He didn't announce what he was going to do. He simply located the tools, identified the problems, and started. Ivy found him on the porch in the early afternoon with a hammer and what remained of her supply of spare nails, reseating the boards on the porch rail that had been loose since summer. When he finished, he moved to the barn with Eli trailing behind him like a small, bundled shadow. She followed them, not to supervise, she told herself, but because there were things in the barn that needed her attention too. The 2 goats were restless. The smaller one, the gray she'd named Murph, because Holt always called difficult things by friendly names, had been off her feed for 2 days, and Ivy hadn't yet decided whether it was the cold or something worse. Cole was clearing a section of barn floor where debris had blown in through the damaged roof section when she came in. Eli had found a spot on a hay bale near the goat pen and was watching Murph with the serious concentration of a child working on a problem. She's not eating right, Eli said, without looking up. I know, Ivy said. I'm trying to figure out why. She's cold, Eli said. Her ears are cold. He reached through the pen slats and touched the gray goat's ear gently. Murph turned and sniffed his hand, then stayed still, didn't back away. Animals don't eat right when they're cold enough. Ivy looked at Cole. Cole shrugged, with an expression that said, he's not wrong. How does a 6-year-old know that? She asked. He's 5, Cole said. and he spent last spring at a sheep station south of the ridgeline with a man who knew a lot about animals. You move around a lot, she said. It came out more direct than she'd intended. Cole's jaw worked once before he answered. We have, he said. That's changing. She wasn't sure if she believed that exactly, but she didn't say so. They moved the goats to the smaller interior stall where the wind didn't reach, added bedding, and Ivy rigged a heavy canvas square across the worst of the roof gap, using rope and the iron hooks her grandfather had driven into the beam for exactly this kind of emergency. Cole held the canvas taut while she worked the rope through, and they didn't say much. The work required too much attention. But she noticed that he handled the heavy material without complaint and adjusted his grip instinctively when she needed more slack, as though they'd worked together long enough to develop a rhythm. They hadn't. That was the strange thing. They'd known each other for less than a day. When they came back inside, stomping snow from their boots, Eli announced that he was hungry and would like to know what else there was besides beans, in the politely phrased but completely earnest way of a child who has been raised to be honest but also courteous about it. Eli, Cole said, a warning in his tone. It's a fair question, Ivy said, and something in her chest did a small, unexpected thing when Eli grinned. She made corn porridge with the last of the good maple sugar Holt had put up in the spring, and they ate around the fire while the snow came down outside in absolute silence now, which was somehow louder than the wind had been. Eli fell asleep before he finished his bowl, slumping sideways into Cole's arm, and Cole moved him carefully to the bedroll, and then came back and sat at the table with the look of a man who had been awake too long and was beginning to run out of the energy it took to hold himself together. Ivy poured him more coffee. He looked at it for a moment without drinking it. I'm sorry for this, he said quietly. For what? Using your supplies, your space, your time. He turned the cup in his hands. You weren't in a position to easily say no, and I knew that when I knocked. She considered lying, saying it was fine, it was nothing, she had plenty. She didn't. You're right that I'm stretched thin, she said. You're wrong that I couldn't say no. I've said no to harder things than a man in a blizzard. He looked up. I opened this door because I chose to, she said. Not because you backed me into a corner. Don't take credit for my decision. He was quiet for a moment. Then very slowly, something shifted in his face, the tightly held tension around his eyes, the set of his jaw. And for just a moment he looked like a man who was almost amused and almost something else, something more tender than amusement. Then it was gone. You're direct, he said. I'm practical, she said. There's a difference. He almost smiled. She caught it at the edge of his mouth before it disappeared. The second night passed easier than the first, not because anything had changed, but because the strangeness had worn down a little, the way the roughest edge of anything wears down with contact. Ivy slept in her room with the door half open out of habit, and she lay in the dark listening to the wind work down to a murmur, and she thought about the folded letter behind the chimney brick, and about the name Victor Granger, and about the way Cole Mercer kept checking the ridge. She thought about Eli saying she's cold, her ears are cold, with the seriousness of a small person who had learned to pay close attention to things because things often mattered. She thought about the way Cole had said, I walked away from something. There's a difference. She didn't know yet what he'd walked away from. She didn't know yet that the thing he'd walked away from had been looking for him for months, and that it would find him, find both of them, before the week was out, and that when it arrived, it would bring with it the worst kind of trouble, the kind that already had paperwork. She fell asleep before she worked any of it out. On the third day, the storm cracked. Not broke. Cracked. The way thick ice cracks on a river when the temperature swings, showing the dark water underneath before it closes over again. There was a window of 3 hours in the late morning when the snow stopped and the clouds thinned enough to let through a pale, cold light that lay across the white hillside like something borrowed. Ivy stood on the porch and breathed air that smelled like clean stone and pine and the particular mineral cold of mountain altitude, and she felt the familiar longing she always felt when the world clarified after a storm, the longing to walk far enough to see everything. Cole came out behind her. He stood at the rail he'd fixed the day before, and looked at the ridge. She watched him looking. You're calculating, she said. Trying to, he said. And? He turned to look at her. His face was fully visible in the pale light. and she could see things in it that the firelit evenings had obscured. The tiredness that went deeper than missed sleep, the particular care around the eyes of a man who had been holding himself together for a long time through the effort of will rather than ease. "I need to go tomorrow," he said. "When this opens, I have to be ahead of it." "Ahead of who?" she said. He didn't answer that directly. "I have a man I trust in Caldwell. He can help me get Eli somewhere settled until this is done." "Until what is done?" "Ivy." Her name in his mouth was different, not weighted exactly, just careful, like it meant more than a convenient way to address her. "The less you know about it, the safer you are." "I'm already involved," she said. "You're in my cabin. I've fed your son. If whoever is following you comes here asking questions, I'm going to have to answer them with no information, which is not the same as being safe. It's just being ignorant." He looked at her for a long time. The pale light shifted as a thin layer of cloud moved back across the sun, and the world went gray again, and somewhere behind the tree line the wind was already building. "There are men looking for me," he said at last. "Not lawmen. Men who work for someone who wants something from me that I'm not willing to give. They've been tracking me for about 3 months." "What do they want from you?" He looked away from her, back at the ridge. His hands were loose at his sides. It was the posture of a man who had rehearsed not appearing tense. "My name," he said finally. She waited. He said nothing else. Just, "My name." And somehow the way he said it made it sound like a thing worth hunting across 3 months of territory, a thing large enough to send armed men over a winter ridge. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated, like he'd expected more. "All right," she said again. "You go tomorrow, if it opens. You take Eli to your man in Caldwell, and you make sure whoever is behind you keeps following you and doesn't decide to stop here first and ask me questions I can't answer." He turned to face her fully. In the gray light, his expression was unguarded for just a second. Surprised, maybe, or something closer to struck, like she'd said the one thing he hadn't been prepared for, which was just simple practicality dressed up as nothing. "I'll make sure of it," he said quietly. "Good," she said. She went back inside. The wind came back with the cloud, driving the cold down off the upper ridge, and the window of pale light closed, and the mountain went white and gray and iron again. And inside the cabin, Eli was at the table drawing shapes in the condensation on the window glass with one finger, concentrating on each shape with absolute seriousness. Ivy stood in the middle of her kitchen and watched him and felt something she couldn't name and didn't try to. That night, after Eli had gone to sleep, Cole repaired the gap in the north wall. He didn't announce it. She heard him moving and came to the doorway to see him crouched at the base of the wall with a strip of oilcloth he'd cut from the roll in the barn and a line of tacks from the hardware tin on the shelf, systematically sealing the gap her grandfather had never quite gotten around to. The draft that had been cutting through since October, that particular cold tongue of air that she'd learned to dress for even inside her own house, stopped. Simply stopped. She stood in the doorway and felt the absence of it, and understood she hadn't fully realized how constant it had been until it was gone. He stood up when he was done, rolled down his sleeves, and looked at his work. Then he looked at her. "The tax will hold until spring," he said. "In spring you'll want to replace it with something more permanent." "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly, not dismissing the thanks, accepting it with the minimum motion required, the way a man does when he's not used to receiving it and doesn't quite know what to do with it. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll be gone before first light if the sky's clear." "I know," she said. She went back to bed. The north wall was quiet for the first time in months. She lay in the dark listening to its silence, and she thought about a man who repaired the gaps in a stranger's house at midnight without being asked, and she thought about a child who touched a sick goat's ear with perfect gentleness and said, "She's cold, her ears are cold," as though caring was simply the obvious response to any situation. And she thought about my name, said in a voice that carried the weight of something much larger than a name. She slept badly. In the morning, when she rose before dawn and went to the front room, Cole's bedroll was rolled tight and stacked neatly in the corner, and his coat and hat and pack were gone from the hooks by the door. And Eli was sitting on the rolled bedroll with his knees pulled up to his chest, still in his socks, looking at the door as if looking hard enough at it could answer a question he hadn't figured out how to ask. Ivy stood in the doorway to her room and looked at him. He went to get the horse ready, she said. Not a question. Eli looked at her. Then very quietly he said to say thank you. He said to say, he paused, and she could see him trying to get the words exactly right. He said to say you're one of the finest people he's met on this side of the mountains. Ivy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, come have some breakfast before you go. Eli uncurled from the bedroll and followed her to the kitchen, and she put the last of the corn porridge on and sliced the very last of the bread. And Cole came in from the barn with snow on his shoulders and ice in the crease of his hat, and the careful, controlled expression she'd learned to read as the face he wore when something was costing him more than he was going to say. They ate without talking much. Eli asked if Murph would be all right. Ivy said yes. Eli said good, because he'd been worried about her, and Cole looked at his son with an expression that lasted about 2 seconds and then was gone. But in those 2 seconds, Ivy saw in it something that made her chest ache quietly. At the door, Cole reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a folded amount of bills, more than she'd expected, more than was reasonable for 2 nights of food and shelter, and held them out to her. That's too much, she said. It's what it's worth, he said. It's more than what it's worth. Ivy. Again, that careful way of using her name. Take it. She took it. He looked at her for a long moment that held more than it should have for how little time they'd known each other, and then he put his hat on and picked up his pack and took Eli's hand, and they walked out into the sharp, clear morning. She stood on the fixed porch and watched them cross the yard to where the horse was tied at the barn gate. Cole lifted Eli up first, then swung himself up behind him, and the horse moved out through the gate and down the track toward the valley road. Eli turned once, at the bottom of the slope, and raised one hand. Ivy raised hers. She stood there until they were gone, until the sound of hooves on frozen ground faded into the silence of the mountain, and all that was left was the pale winter sky, and the cold, clean air, and the barn with its gap sealed with oilcloth, and the north wall with its drafts stopped, and the goats in the inner stall where the wind couldn't reach. She stood there longer than she needed to. Then she went inside and folded the money he'd left and put it on the table, and she sat down and looked at it, and she thought, whatever he's running from, he's not running from the kind of thing that goes away on its own. And she thought, I hope Caldwell is far enough. She didn't know yet that it wasn't. She told herself it would get easier. It was the same thing she'd told herself after Holt died, that the empty space a person leaves behind eventually fills in with the ordinary business of living, with work and weather and the small daily emergencies of keeping a mountain homestead running. She'd been right then, mostly. The grief had rounded off at the edges, the way everything sharp does given enough time. The cabin had stopped feeling like a held breath waiting for her grandfather to come back through the door. But Cole Mercer had only been in her house for 2.5 days, and the space he left behind was different. It wasn't grief. It was more like static, a frequency she hadn't known she was tuned to until it went off the air. She cleaned the front room with more thoroughness than it required. She restacked the firewood. She checked on Murph 3 times in one morning, which was 2 times more than necessary because Murph was clearly improving, eating steadily, and no longer holding her ears flat. She found herself standing in the barn doorway with no particular reason to be standing in the barn doorway, just looking at the space on the floor where the broken debris had been before Cole cleared it. She swept it again, even though it didn't need sweeping. On the 4th day, she went down to the valley. She needed supplies she'd been putting off buying until she had money, and now she had money, more than she'd expected to have, so there was no logical reason to delay. She told herself this firmly while she hitched the old roan gelding to the supply cart, told herself it again when she passed the spot on the lower track where Cole's horse had left clear hoofprints in the frozen mud, deep and spaced wide, moving fast. She didn't study them. She kept her eyes forward. The town of Harwick sat at the base of the mountain where the valley road turned north, a single main street of weathered storefronts, a feed store, a dry goods merchant, a smithy, a small hotel that also served as the post office, and the Long Bench Saloon which functioned as the town's meeting hall, courthouse, and primary source of news all at once. Ivy knew everyone in Harwick by face, if not by name. She'd grown up coming down this road with Holt, sitting beside him on this same cart, learning which merchants gave honest weight and which ones had a thumb on the scale. She tied the roan in front of the dry goods and went inside. Ada Pruitt was already there, which was not surprising since Ada was reliably present wherever information was being exchanged. Ada was 62, sharp as a struck flint, and had an interest in other people's business that was so thorough and so energetic that it had long since crossed from nosiness into a kind of community service. She knew everything that happened within 20 miles of Harwick before it finished happening. "Ivy Rowan," Ada said, straightening up from the bolt of cotton she'd been examining. "I heard you had company during the storm." Ivy kept her expression neutral. "You heard that fast." "Tom Lester saw a rider going up your track before the worst of it hit. Wondered if you'd had trouble." "No trouble," Ivy said. "A man and his boy needed to get out of the weather. They stayed 2 nights and moved on." Ada studied her with the particular intensity she brought to details that didn't quite add up. "What kind of man?" "The polite kind," Ivy said, and moved past her to the counter. She bought oats, dried beans, salt, a small tin of lard, and a length of good rope she'd been needing since October. She also bought a second lamp wick and 2 boxes of matches, because she'd burned through her supply faster than expected in the short days. The storekeeper, a thin man named Prescott, who wrote everything down in a ledger before he said a word about price, tallied the total and named his figure, and Ivy paid it from the folded money Cole had left. She stood at the counter and felt something unresolved in her chest as the bill went into Prescott's drawer. She couldn't explain why using that particular money felt different from using any other money. It was money. It was what she needed. There was nothing attached to it. She kept feeling the way she felt anyway. She loaded the supplies into the cart and was about to climb up when a voice behind her said, "Miss Rowan?" She turned. She didn't recognize the man at first. He was standing at the edge of the boardwalk across the street, broad-framed and wearing a dark coat with a fur collar that didn't belong on anyone who'd earned their money honestly working in a place with this much wind and mud. He was perhaps 50, or a hard 45, with a wide jaw and pale eyes that moved around a room the way a card player's eyes do, always measuring. "I don't believe I know you," she said. "Victor Granger," he said, and he crossed the street toward her with the confident walk of a man who was accustomed to being waited on. "I have interests in the area. I've been meaning to pay a call on some of the mountain properties." Ivy felt a particular stillness come over her. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. Victor Granger. The name from the paper. The name at the bottom of the letter behind the chimney brick. "Is that right?" she said. Flat. Not a question. "Your grandfather's place, specifically." He stopped a few feet away and looked at the cart, at the supplies, at her with an assessment that wasn't quite rude but wasn't anything else either. "Holt Rowan's acreage. I understand you're the current holder." "I'm the owner," she said. She let the word carry what it needed to carry. Something moved across his face. Amusement, maybe, or its more condescending cousin. "Of course," he said. "That's what I meant. I'd like to discuss the property with you when you have time. There are some matters related to the outstanding loans that I think you should understand fully before—" "I understand them fully," she said. He paused, recalibrated. "You may think you do," he said, and his voice was gentle now, the kind of gentle that's harder to argue with than bluntness because it implies that you're the one being unreasonable. "But some of the figures have changed since the original notes were written, and there's the matter of the interest accumulation, and I'd hate for you to be caught off guard by the timeline. Mr. Granger," she said, "I've read every document attached to that land. I know what's owed and to whom and by when." "Then you know how little margin you have." She looked at him for a long moment. His face was pleasant. His eyes were not. "I know exactly what margin I have," she said. "Thank you for introducing yourself." She climbed into the cart, took up the reins, and drove away without looking back. She didn't let herself breathe normally until she was past the end of the main street. Her hands on the reins were steady. Inside her coat, her heart was doing something complicated. Victor Granger. Here, in Harwick, asking about her land by name, by the specific details of the debts, as though he'd read the documents himself, as though he had copies. She thought about Cole saying, "I walked away from something and there are men looking for me." She thought about the letter behind the chimney brick, with Granger's name at the bottom, and language about land acquisition and railroad access and mountain passage rights that she'd read 3 times and still hadn't fully untangled. She drove the roan up the mountain road and thought about the fact that these 2 things, Victor Granger asking about her property and Cole Mercer hiding from someone who wanted his name, had arrived in the same week. She did not think that was a coincidence. She didn't know yet what it was instead. She spent that evening going through every document she could find in the cabin. Holt had kept his papers in a battered tin box under the floorboard beneath his bed, a hiding place so obvious that it was practically an insult. But he'd always said that anyone willing to search under an old man's bed had already declared themselves, and you handled declared enemies differently than hidden ones. The box held the original deed, the loan papers, 3 years of payment records written in Holt's cramped and careful hand, 2 letters from the bank in Caldwell, and the folded letter she'd found behind the chimney brick. She took the chimney brick letter to the table and read it again in full lamplight, slowly, the way you read something when you know the meaning is in the gaps between the words as much as in the words themselves. It was addressed to Holt from a man whose name she didn't recognize. Not Granger, a different name, someone acting as an intermediary. It talked about the expansion of the Harwick to Caldwell rail line and the projected right-of-way through the mountain corridor, and it mentioned that certain properties along the upper slope would be needed for the grade, and that it would be in the landowner's best interest to negotiate directly, rather than waiting for acquisition proceedings. It mentioned that a Mr. Granger had been authorized to approach landowners on behalf of the interested parties. And then, in the last paragraph, it said something that made Ivy stop and read it twice. It said that the timeline for acquisition had been accelerated due to the involvement of the Mercer Freight Company in the Northern Route development, Mercer Freight. She sat very still at the table for a long time. Then she put the letter back in the tin box, put the tin box back under the floor, and lay in her bed in the dark with her arms at her sides and her eyes open, thinking about a man who had given his name only as Cole, and a 5-year-old boy who knew how to tell when an animal was cold, and the way Cole had kept watching the ridge. She didn't sleep well for the second night in a row. 2 days later, an old trapper named Silas Monk came through. Silas was not a social call kind of person. He moved through the mountain territory in loops and angles determined by trapping lines and weather patterns, and the only reason he stopped at any given cabin was if it was on his route and he needed to fill his water canteen or get out of the rain. He'd known Holt for 30 years, and after Holt died he'd kept stopping, which was the closest thing to a condolence he was capable of expressing. I was 67, weathered to a kind of permanent leather, and he saw more of what moved through the mountain territory than any other living person. He came in, drank 2 cups of coffee, refused biscuits because he was particular about biscuits and didn't trust anyone else's, and was almost back out the door when Ivy said, "Silas, have you seen anything strange on the trails in the last week? Riders moving fast, maybe?" Silas turned around. He had a very specific way of turning around when something got his attention. Slow, deliberate, like a compass needle finding north. "What kind of strange?" "Armed riders, moving north, maybe 3 or 4 together." He looked at her for a moment with those pale, wind-worn eyes. "Saw 4 men come down off the High Ridge Trail day before yesterday, moving hard for this time of year. One of them was wearing city clothes under his trail coat, which is the kind of thing that sticks in a man's memory because it's stupid." He paused. "They weren't headed north." Ivy felt her stomach drop. "Which direction?" "South," he said, "toward Caldwell." She kept her face still. "Did they stop anywhere?" "Not that I saw." He was watching her with the careful interest of a man who had survived 67 years, partly by knowing when people were asking questions that mattered. "You want to tell me what you're not telling me?" "Not yet," she said. He nodded slowly. This was apparently an acceptable answer. He put his hat back on and opened the door, and then he stopped again and said, without turning around, "That rider who came up your track before the storm, the one with the boy." She waited. "Word in the valley is someone's been asking about a man matching that description, asking with the kind of money that makes people remember things they thought they'd forgotten." "Who's asking?" "Granger's men," he said, and he walked out. Ivy stood in her doorway and watched him cross the yard and disappear into the tree line, and she stood there long after he was gone, the cold coming in through the open door, the mountain silent around her. Granger's men were going to Caldwell. Cole had a man in Caldwell he trusted. He'd said so himself. "I have a man I trust in Caldwell. He can help me get Eli somewhere settled." She didn't let herself stay at the door too long. She had work to do, and standing in an open doorway in 20-degree air was not part of doing it. She went inside, shut the door, and stood at the table with her hands flat on the surface, and thought through what she knew. She knew Victor Granger had come to Harwick personally. That wasn't the behavior of someone running a side operation. That was someone who thought this particular acquisition was important enough to oversee directly. She knew the letter in the tin box connected the railroad expansion to the Mercer Freight Company. She knew Cole's name, his full name, whatever it was significant enough that men had spent 3 months tracking him across mountain territory. She knew that Granger's men were now heading toward the same town where Cole had been going. She didn't know what Cole had planned to do when he got there. She didn't know if he'd made it. She didn't know if his man in Caldwell was still in a position to help him, or if Granger's advance riders had already made that complicated. She wasn't sure there was anything she could do about any of it from here. She told herself that firmly. She believed it for about 4 days. The work helped. It always helped. The mountain didn't care about Victor Granger or railroad rights of way or mysterious cowboys with weighted names. It had its own demands, constant and specific, and those demands gave her something to put her hands to. She repaired the section of fence along the eastern boundary that the snow had flattened. She worked on the barn roof properly now that the worst of the weather had passed, using the lumber she'd been saving and the skills Holt had drilled into her over 20 years. She wasn't fast with a hammer. She never had been. But she was accurate, and the roof section she rebuilt was tighter than the original had been. She cut firewood until her shoulders ached, and then cut more, because the serious cold was still weeks away, and she had learned not to underestimate it. She went to bed tired and woke up early and went through the days with the efficiency of someone who had learned that staying busy was not the same as avoiding things, but was sometimes the appropriate response to a situation you couldn't yet act on. She was mending a harness strap in the barn on the 6th day after Cole had left when she heard the horse coming up the track. She went still. Not out of fear, she'd had enough time to think that fear was a response she could afford to be deliberate about, but out of attention. She listened to the sound of the approach, measuring it. One horse, moving at a walk, not a trot. That was a rider who wasn't in a hurry, or a rider who was too tired to be. She set the harness down and walked to the barn door. The horse was the same one. She recognized the blaze on its face, a crooked white mark like a lightning bolt, and the way it carried its head slightly to the right. She recognized Cole before she could make out his face, because she had apparently cataloged the particular way he sat in a saddle without noticing she'd done it. He was alone. Ivy walked out of the barn and stood in the middle of the yard and watched him come up the track. When he was close enough to read his face, she read it, and what she read there made something in her go careful and alert. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been handed something else to carry on top of it. He stopped the horse at the yard gate and looked down at her, and he said without preamble, "Eli's safe. He's with a woman I trust in Caldwell. She'll keep him until I send word." "All right," she said. "I couldn't stay there." He got down from the horse, slowly, she noticed, like his body was protesting, and led it through the gate. Granger's men had already been through asking questions. "I don't know what they found." "They left Harwick 4 days ago," she said. "Silas Monk saw them on the high ridge heading south." He stopped, looked at her. "You knew they were going south." "I found out after you were already gone." He absorbed this. "And you stayed here." "It's my land," she said. He looked at her for another moment, with that expression she'd seen twice now, the one that appeared for just a second before he put the composed face back on, and then he led the horse toward the barn and said, "I need to tell you something." "I know," she said. He glanced at her. "About Mercer Freight," she said. He stopped walking. The horse stopped too, patient and uninterested. Cole stood with the reins in his hand and looked at her and said nothing for a long moment. "How much do you know?" he said finally. "I know there's a letter in my grandfather's tin box connecting the railroad expansion to the Mercer Freight Company," she said. "I know Victor Granger has been authorized to acquire land in the mountain corridor on behalf of whoever is involved in the northern route. And I know your last name isn't something you were going to tell me unless you had to." The silence stretched. A crow called from somewhere in the tree line, twice, and went quiet. "Cole Mercer," she said. Not a question. He exhaled, long, slow, like he'd been holding it since Caldwell. "Yes," he said, "of Mercer Freight." "I was," he said. "That's what I walked away from." She crossed her arms and looked at him. He was watching her with that level, tired honesty she'd come to recognize as his default when he ran out of the energy to manage what he let her see. "Why?" she said. Because it was killing things I needed to keep alive, he said. My son. Whatever was left of me after Margaret died. He paused. The company had been moving in a direction I didn't agree with. Land acquisition by means that weren't. He stopped, started again. My father built Mercer Freight on contract work and honest negotiation. The men running it after he died weren't his kind of men. And Victor Granger. Granger has been working with the company's current board for 2 years, Cole said. He's the acquisition side. He finds the land they need, and he finds the means to take it, and the board doesn't ask how. He looked at the ground briefly, then back at her. When I left, I removed the one board member who would have stopped them from going as far as they wanted to go. Me. My shares, my vote, my name. Without me objecting, there's no break on it. So they need you back. They need me back, or they need my signature on documents that transfer my remaining interest, he said. Granger's job is to get one or the other. Ivy uncrossed her arms. She walked to the barn door and opened it and stood back so he could bring the horse in, and they worked in silence for a few minutes. She took the saddlebag while he untacked. She found the brush. He started working the horse down. And in the ordinariness of the work, she could feel the weight of what he'd told her settling into the shape of something she needed to think about carefully. Your land is in the projected corridor, he said. He didn't look up from the horse. I'm not sure if that's why Granger's in Harwick, or if finding me here is a separate matter, or if it's both. Does it matter which? He considered that. For you, maybe not. The result is the same. He set the brush down and leaned on the stall rail. His coat was open, and she could see that his shirt was rumpled, and there was a tear at the shoulder seam that hadn't been there before, and she noticed this the way she noticed details without meaning to. Ivy, I didn't come back here to involve you in this any further. Then why did you come back? He was quiet for a second too long. Because Eli kept asking about the gray goat, he said. She looked at him. His face was completely straight, which was how she knew he meant it as a deflection, and also how she knew it wasn't entirely a deflection, and the combination of both things at once made her look away before her face did something she hadn't decided to let it do. Murph is fine, she said. She's eating. Good, he said. You should eat too. You look like you haven't slept in 2 days. 3, he said. She walked out of the barn. At the door she stopped and said, without turning around, the south-facing room has a window. You can see the lower track from the bed. If that matters. A pause. It matters, he said quietly. She went inside and started the fire. She didn't let herself think about what it meant that she was relieved he'd come back. Not just about the situation, not just because 2 people were harder to outmaneuver than one. She didn't examine it. She simply started the fire and put the pot on and began cutting the last of the carrots into the soup. And by the time Cole came in from the barn with snow on his coat and his hat in his hand, the cabin was warm and the soup was on, and the 2 of them moved around the kitchen with the slightly careful choreography of people who didn't know yet how much room to give each other. It was, she thought, a particular kind of strange, the way you could know almost nothing about a person and still find yourself able to share a kitchen with them without discomfort. Or maybe that was just her. Maybe she had spent 8 months alone and lost her ability to gauge what was normal. They ate. Cole thanked her. She waved the thanks off because it embarrassed her slightly in a way she couldn't justify. He asked about the fence repair she'd done along the east boundary. He'd seen it coming up the track. And she explained the issue and what she'd used, and he nodded in the specific way of someone who actually understood what she was describing rather than just performing understanding, and she found that she appreciated the difference more than she expected. After, he sat at the table with his coffee and said, I need to figure out what Granger is planning. Timeline, specifically. He mentioned foreclosure documents? She looked up. He mentioned it to me on the street in Harwick. Said the figures had changed, said he'd hate for me to be caught off guard by the timeline. It was, she chose her words. He was pleasant about it. That was the concerning part. Cole nodded slowly. Granger is always pleasant when he thinks the outcome is settled. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. He wouldn't be handling this personally if he thought there was real resistance. Then we should make sure there is, she said. He looked at her. Real resistance, she said. Documents, records, everything in the tin box. Whatever you know about the company's activities. If he's running an operation that's not entirely legal, and from what you're describing, I don't think it is, Then there has to be something that wouldn't survive being looked at directly. Cole was quiet for a moment. There are things, he said carefully, records I kept, things I documented because I knew. When I left, I knew there might come a point where I'd need proof of what I walked away from. Where are those records? Safe, he said. Not here, but reachable. Then that's the place to start, she said. He looked at her across the table with the full weight of his attention, which she was beginning to understand was something he didn't direct at people carelessly. You understand what you're suggesting means we're not waiting for this to come to us, he said. I know what it means, she said. Granger doesn't take obstruction quietly. I wasn't planning on being quiet either, she said. The fire popped. The wind moved outside, low and constant. The lamp threw a steady circle of light across the table between them, and Cole Mercer sat in it with his coffee going cold and looked at this woman who had opened her door to strangers in a blizzard, who had gone through her grandfather's papers in the middle of the night by herself, who had stood on a muddy street and held ground against Victor Granger without flinching, and he felt something shift in the careful arrangement of distance he'd been maintaining. He didn't name what it was. He wasn't ready to do that, but he felt it. All right, he said, then here's what I know. And he started talking. He talked for a long time, not in the way of a man who had been waiting to unburden himself. Cole wasn't built that way, and she already knew it. He talked the way a person talks when they've made a decision to be precise and complete and are measuring every word against that standard. He started with his father, which surprised her, because she'd expected him to start with the company. His father's name was James Mercer. He'd built Mercer Freight from a single wagon contract hauling mining equipment in the early days of the Western Push, grown it through 20 years of hard work and blunt negotiation into the largest private freight operation in the Northern Territories, covering 3 rail connectors and 14 overland routes. James Mercer had been, by Cole's accounting, a difficult man in most respects, but a fair one in the ones that mattered. He'd paid his workers honestly. He'd honored contracts even when they stopped being profitable. He'd turned down 3 government acquisition offers because he didn't believe government management of private routes served anyone well. He'd died 11 years ago of a heart that had been working too hard for too many years. And he'd left the company to Cole with the instruction that was more philosophy than directive: keep it honest. Cole had tried. He'd sat on the board, cast votes, managed route contracts, handled the labor disputes with the care of someone who understood that the men doing the actual work were the reason there was a company to argue over. He'd been good at it. He hadn't particularly liked it, but good at it was its own kind of obligation. Then the railroad expansion had started. Not Mercer Freight's expansion, the regional rail network's expansion, the 3rd line pushing north through the mountain corridor, which would have required either cooperation or competition with Mercer Freight's overland routes. The board had seen an opportunity. They'd begun quiet negotiations with the rail company, not as competitors, but as partners. Specifically, they'd seen that the rail needed mountain passage rights, and the mountain passage ran through privately held land, and acquiring that land was the kind of work that a freight company with capital and political connections could do efficiently. Cole had objected. He'd objected not because land acquisition was inherently wrong, but because the methods the board proposed were not. Promissory notes purchased from struggling landowners at discount, with terms that almost guaranteed default. Loan agreements designed to look like assistance and function like traps. Foreclosure proceedings timed to coincide with bad harvests and market downturns. He'd laid it out at the table with the evidence he'd compiled, and the board had listened politely and then voted 8-1 to proceed. The one was Cole. He'd spent 6 months after that trying to build an external case, taking his documentation to a land commissioner he trusted, who had reviewed it and been quietly reassigned to a district office 3 states away before he could act on it. He'd tried 2 lawyers, one of whom declined and one of whom disappeared from the case abruptly after a meeting with someone he wouldn't name. He'd watched Granger go to work on a list of properties that overlapped almost exactly with the land around this mountain. And then Margaret had died. He didn't say much about that, just said her name and that it was during childbirth, and that Eli had lived, and that in the weeks after he'd understood with complete clarity that he could not continue to spend the energy he was spending, fighting a board that had more resources and less conscience than he did, and also raise a newborn child alone, and also stay sane. He'd made a choice. He'd removed himself from the board formally, transferred his voting interest into a trust structured to prevent it from being easily converted, and left. He'd taken Eli and the records he'd been compiling, and nothing else of real consequence. He'd spent 2 years moving, not hiding, exactly. He'd been deliberate about that. Moving. Giving Eli a life that was made of actual days rather than waiting rooms and board meetings, and the particular suffocating weight of inherited consequence. Granger had found him anyway, or rather, had found the pattern of his movement and begun closing the gap. When he finished talking, the fire had burned down considerably, and the coffee in both cups was long cold. Ivy sat across the table with her hands folded, looking at the grain of the wood between them, thinking. "The trust," she said, "the one that holds your voting interest. Can Granger access it without your signature?" "Not legally," Cole said. "And not legally?" A pause. "That's the part I'm less certain about," he said. "The trust was structured by a lawyer I believed was trustworthy. Whether he's remained so under whatever pressure Granger can bring is—" He stopped. "I don't know." "Where are the records you kept?" she asked. "The documentation of what the board was doing." "With a man named Fletcher in Caldwell, a former company accountant. He left before I did, for his own reasons. And he took copies of the ledgers that document the acquisition activities." He paused. "If those records reached the right person in the Territorial Land Office, they would be enough to at minimum halt the foreclosure proceedings pending investigation." "Then that's what we need to do," she said. Cole rubbed his face with one hand, a gesture she hadn't seen him make before, which told her he was more tired than he was managing to look. "The problem," he said, "is that Granger is already in Harwick, which means he's already operating on a timeline. And if he's moving on your land, he's moving on the other properties in the corridor too. There are 7 other families on the mountain slope who have loans that Granger's operation bought at some point in the last 18 months. Ivy looked up. 7. At least. She thought about Harlan Doyle, about the kicked-in door and the belongings in the snow. She thought about the 41 years and the oak tree and the wife buried underneath it, and Victor Granger's men not looking at the grave once. She thought about the specific name of rage that particular image had always brought up in her. Not hot rage, the kind that made people reckless, but the cold, settled kind that made people methodical. "Then we do both," she said. "We get word to Fletcher and Caldwell about the records, and we warn the other families on the slope." Cole was watching her carefully. "That's not a small undertaking." "No," she said, "it isn't. And if Granger moves faster than we do, then we find out whether documents delivered after the fact can undo what he's already done," she said. "But I'd rather find out from a position where we tried." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a care she was beginning to recognize as his version of warmth, "You know this isn't your fight in the same way it's mine." She looked at him directly. "Victor Granger has my grandfather's debt papers in his pocket and is planning to foreclose on this land before the spring thaw," she said. "How exactly is it not my fight?" He didn't argue. He recognized when an argument was settled. They made a plan that night. It was not an elegant plan. There were too many unknowns and too few resources for elegance. But it was practical, and it was theirs. Cole would ride for Caldwell in the morning, moving fast this time, using the high ridge trail to avoid the valley road where Granger's men might be positioned. He would reach Fletcher, secure the records, and find a route to get them to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Pendleton, which was far enough from Granger's sphere of influence that they had at least a reasonable hope of reaching an honest ear. Ivy would stay. She would go to the neighboring properties, the Pruitt place first, since Ada was already the closest thing the mountain had to a communication network, and she would tell them what she knew and what was coming and what they might be able to do to prepare. "Be careful what you say to Granger if he comes while I'm gone," Cole said. "I'm always careful," she said. "That's not the same as the kind of careful I mean." He looked at her steadily. "He's not going to show his hand until he has to. Don't show yours first." "I know how to talk to a man like that," she said. He accepted this. He'd learned by now that she knew what she knew. Before he went to sleep, in the south-facing room, which she'd cleared of the accumulated storage items that had built up in there since Holt's death, Cole stopped in the doorway and said, "There's something else." She waited. "The property records Granger is using," he said. "The loan documents he's purchasing. I have reason to believe some of them have been altered. The original terms were different from what's in the copies he's been filing. It's difficult to prove without the originals, but if your grandfather kept his copies, He kept everything, she said. The tin box under the floor. Cole nodded slowly. Don't let those documents out of this house, he said. I wasn't planning to. He looked at her once more in the lamplight from the hallway, a look that lasted just a moment longer than the conversation required. And then he said goodnight and went to bed, and she listened to the sound of him moving in the south-facing room and then going quiet, and she stood in the kitchen and felt the particular texture of a situation that had grown large enough that she could no longer see all its edges at once. She pulled the tin box out that night and went through every paper again, slowly, checking the loan documents against the payment records Holt had kept. Holt's handwriting was difficult, small and angular, the letters cramped together from a lifetime of writing on whatever scraps were available. But she'd been reading it for 20 years and she could move through it. She compared dates, figures, the compounding interest calculations. It took her 2 hours. At the end of the 2 hours, she sat back and looked at what she'd found. The original loan amount matched Holt's records. The interest rate matched. But the date of the first payment deadline, the date by which Holt had needed to make the first significant payment or trigger the escalation clause, was different. In Holt's own records, that date was 8 months after the loan origination. In the copy of the loan agreement that Granger had sent in the letter, the deadline was listed as 4 months. 4 months. In a year when a late frost had killed the crop, which meant the escalation clause had triggered not because Holt missed a payment, but because the deadline had been moved without his knowledge, making it structurally impossible for him to meet. And once the escalation clause triggered, the additional interest it compounded had pushed the total debt well beyond what a working mountain homestead could service. She sat with that for a long time. Then she folded Holt's original payment records, tucked them inside the cover of the farm ledger, and put the ledger on the shelf where it looked like an ordinary book. She put the tin box back under the floor. She put the altered loan document separately, in the gap behind the chimney brick where the letter had been. She went to bed. She didn't sleep particularly well, but she slept. Cole left before light again. She was awake and gave him coffee and the remainder of the cornbread from the previous morning, and they stood in the cold kitchen and went over the plan once more in the specific, practical way of people who have decided that thorough is more useful than confident. Fletcher will need to know it's me, he said. He won't move for anyone else. I understand. Tell him... He stopped, started again. Tell the families on the slope that the deadline for the foreclosure proceedings is most likely the first week of the new month. That gives you roughly 3 weeks to build enough noise that the filing attracts attention. 3 weeks, she said. It might be less, he said flatly. Granger doesn't always announce his timelines. She nodded. She was calculating, the way she always calculated, not with panic, but with inventory. What she had, what she needed, what could be done with the gap between them. Cole, she said when he picked up his pack. He stopped. If something goes wrong in Caldwell, I'll send word through Silas, he said. He knows the mountain routes better than Granger's men ever will. She accepted that. At the door, she said, Eli asked about Murph. His mouth did something brief and involuntary. I know. He asks every day. Tell him she's eating like nothing was ever wrong with her, she said, which is almost the truth. He looked at her. In the gray pre-dawn, his face was unguarded in the way it only got when he was tired, and she could see in it, just for a moment, something she recognized because she'd been feeling a version of it herself for the better part of 2 weeks. Something that had no comfortable name because naming it would have required more stillness than either of them had available right now. He put on his hat. He left. Ivy stood at the window and watched the yard go gray and then lighter, and then she washed the cups and banked the fire and put on her coat and went to see Ada Pruitt. Ada's reaction to what Ivy told her was characteristic of Ada. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and then she was quiet for 10 seconds, which was very unusual, and then she said, "That absolute son of a..." and stopped herself and said, "How many families?" 7 that I know of on the slope, Ivy said. There may be more further along the corridor. Ada stood up from her kitchen chair and went to the window and looked out over her own land with the expression of a woman thinking through a fight. She was 62, Ivy remembered. She'd been on this mountain for 38 years. She'd buried a husband and raised 3 sons and weathered bad seasons and bad men, and she had a presence that took up more space than her physical size should have allowed. Tom Lester is 3 miles east, Ada said. The Harriman brothers are further up the north slope. Old Caswell has the piece along the creek. She turned around. Who else? Doyle, Ivy said. Ada's face did something complicated. Harlan. Yes. Ada was quiet for a moment. She and Harlan Doyle had known each other for 40 years, which Ivy knew, and she also knew that for 35 of those 40 years they'd maintained a carefully managed version of not speaking, which had started over a property line dispute and continued as a matter of mutual stubborn pride. Ada looked at the window again. Then she said, "Well, someone's going to have to tell him." "I thought I'd ask if you'd come with me," Ivy said. Ada looked at her. "You want me to go to Harlan Doyle's door?" "I want someone with more standing than a 23-year-old woman alone," Ivy said, "and I want someone he'll actually listen to." "He won't listen to me." "He'll listen to you more than anyone else on this mountain," Ivy said, "whether he admits it or not." Ada made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a curse. She reached for her coat. They spent 3 days going door to door. It was not easy work, and Ivy hadn't expected it to be. The mountain families were not naturally inclined toward collective action. Most of them had come up here precisely because they valued doing things themselves, without asking for or offering involvement in other people's business. The Harriman brothers, 2 bachelors in their 50s who ran a timber operation on the North Slope, were skeptical to the point of hostility until Ivy showed them the discrepancy in the loan document dates, which she'd copied carefully onto a separate page. Seeing the numbers laid out, seeing the structural impossibility of the original deadline, shifted something in their faces from skepticism into a different kind of hardness. Tom Lester was more immediately willing. He was a younger man, mid-30s, with a wife and 2 small children and a cattle operation that was still building toward profitability. He'd noticed his own loan documents looked different from what he thought he'd signed, but hadn't known what to do about it. Ivy told him exactly what to do. Pull every original record he had, make copies, give the copies to Ada for safekeeping, keep the originals locked and hidden. Old Caswell asked only 2 questions. First, whether what Ivy was telling him was true, and when she said yes, he asked, second, what he needed to do. Harlan Doyle was the last stop, and the hardest. He came to the door with the particular wariness of a man who had recently had his door kicked in by strangers and had not yet fully recovered his sense of security. When he saw Ada Pruitt standing behind Ivy on the step, something passed across his face. Not warmth, not yet, but something in the neighborhood of it. He stood back from the door without being asked and let them both in. He listened. He didn't speak until Ivy finished, and then he said quietly, "They took my belongings out of the house." "I know," Ivy said. "In the snow," he said, "like it was trash." "Yes." His jaw worked. He was 70 years old, and he had the dignity of a man who had spent 7 decades building something with his hands, and the specific wound of having that thing treated as refuse was written all over him in a way that was painful to look at directly. "What do we do?" he said. Ada spoke for the first time since they'd arrived. Her voice was quieter than her normal register, more careful. "We make noise," she said. "Enough noise that Granger can't do this quietly anymore." Harlan looked at her. A long, complex look, the kind that carried 35 years of accumulated silence. "You'd have to talk to me civilly," he said. "I'm talking to you civilly right now," Ada said. "You're talking to me practically," he said. "There's a difference." The corner of Ada's mouth moved. "I can work on it," she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a resolution of 35 years of stubborn mutual grievance. But it was something, and Ivy watched it happen and felt the particular satisfaction of seeing 2 people choose the right thing over the easy thing. They rode back down the slope in the late afternoon with a pale winter sun hanging flat and low over the western ridge. Ivy's hands were cold inside her gloves, and her back ached from 3 days of riding, and her mind was running through the timeline Cole had given her. 3 weeks, maybe less. And the ground they'd covered against the ground still ahead. 6 families confirmed, Ada said, plus Harlan makes 7. It's enough to file a collective objection with the land commissioner if we have the documents supporting it, Ivy said. Do we have them? We will, Ivy said, once Cole gets back from Caldwell. Ada rode beside her in silence for a moment. Then, this man, Cole. Ivy kept her eyes on the track ahead. What about him? You trust him, Ada said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, the way Ada made most observations. Direct, clean, without decoration. Ivy considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider everything honestly, even when it was inconvenient. "I think he's the most straightforwardly honest person I've met in a while," she said, which is a strange thing to say about someone who spent 2 days not telling me his last name. "People keep things for different reasons," Ada said. "Yes," Ivy said, "they do." Ada let the subject rest. She was occasionally capable of that. It was after dark when Ivy got back to the cabin, and Cole wasn't there. She'd known he wouldn't be. Caldwell was 2 hard days' ride each way, and he'd only left 3 days ago, which meant even moving well he wouldn't be back until tomorrow at earliest. She knew this. She still stood in the doorway of the empty cabin for a moment before going in, registering the emptiness with a part of her she couldn't fully discipline. She started the fire and ate what she had, and was going through the neighbor's copied loan documents at the table when the knock came. Not the door, the window. 3 taps, measured and deliberate. She went still. Then she moved to the window and looked out, and saw a shape in the dark beside the barn, and the shape raised one hand in a particular gesture she recognized. Not Cole. The figure was shorter and broader, and she exhaled and went to the door. Silas Monk came in without ceremony, stomped the snow from his boots. He got to Caldwell. Ivy felt something loosen in her chest. "And Fletcher?" "Had the records ready," Silas said. Apparently he'd been expecting something like this for a while. He settled into the chair Cole usually took at the table, which Ivy noticed, and reached inside his coat for a folded piece of paper. "He sent this." She took it. Cole's handwriting. She knew it from the list he'd made of the route details their second night, a practical ordered hand, nothing decorative about it. The note said, "Fletcher confirms the ledger records show altered documents on at least 6 properties in the corridor. He has copies of the originals showing different terms. He is willing to testify. I am taking everything to Pendleton on the eastern route. I expect to reach Pendleton in 5 days. Keep the family steady. Don't let Granger move you before I get back." She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it for a moment. "He said one other thing," Silas said. "Verbally, didn't write it down." She looked up. "He said Granger isn't waiting for the official filing deadline," Silas said, his voice flat and even. "He's already filed an emergency acquisition claim with the territorial office in Harwick, based on an alleged non-payment that Granger's own documents say happened 2 months ago." He paused. "Which means the timeline isn't 3 weeks. Ivy felt the shift in her chest. Not panic, never panic, but the specific cold clarity of a situation crystallizing into something that required immediate action. "How long?" she said. "Granger can move on the first property in 3 days," Silas said, "if nobody contests." 3 days. Cole was 5 days from Pendleton and 5 days back. She set the note down on the table and looked at it. She thought about Harlan Doyle's belongings in the snow. She thought about the altered date in the loan document, moved 4 months earlier, structurally designed to fail. She thought about a man who built a freight company honestly, and a son who tried to honor that, and a board that had decided honor was an obstacle. She thought about what she had. 7 families who knew the truth, original documents showing the discrepancy, copies of the altered versions, Ada Pruitt who knew everyone in Harwick by first name, and a tin box under the floor with Holt Rowan's meticulous 30-year record of every transaction he'd ever been part of. She thought about what she didn't have. Cole, Fletcher's ledgers, a lawyer, or a contact in the territorial office she could trust. She picked up the note and said, "Silas, how fast can you get a message to Ada Pruitt tonight?" He looked at her with those pale, wind-worn eyes. "Faster than Granger's riders," he said. "Good," she said. She went to the shelf and took down the farm ledger with Holt's original payment records folded inside the cover, and she took the altered loan document from behind the chimney brick, and she sat down at the table and began writing, carefully, in her clearest hand, a document that laid out the discrepancy between the 2 dates, the compounding effect it had produced, and the names of every family on the slope who had signed a loan document through Granger's operation. She wrote for 2 hours. Silas sat across from her and drank her coffee and didn't say a word, which was exactly what she needed. When she finished, she read it over once, made 2 corrections, and folded it with the supporting documents. Then she looked up. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "We take this to the land office in Harwick ourselves." Silas raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "Not to file it," she said, to put it in front of the land agent before Granger's emergency claim gets processed. Even if the agent is in Granger's pocket, the act of filing a counterdocument on record creates a delay. She paused. Enough of a delay that when Cole gets back from Pendleton with Fletcher's testimony, there's still something to contest. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Holt used to do that, he said finally. Buy time with paperwork until the real argument was ready. I know, she said. He taught me. Outside, the wind had come back up, moving over the mountain in long, cold sweeps that pressed against the cabin walls and found every imperfection. The north wall held silent. The gap Cole had sealed was still sealed, and in the middle of everything else pressing down on her that night, Ivy noticed this and found it steadying in a way she couldn't entirely explain. She banked the fire for the night and checked the lamp oil and stood for a moment in the middle of the room, looking at the folded documents on the table. 3 days until Granger could move. She had 1 day to make those 3 days matter. She went to bed and lay in the dark, and somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the planning and the calculation and the cold, steady determination, was a thread of something that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but lived in the narrow space between them. The recognition that she was small and he was powerful, and the outcome was not guaranteed and might not be fair. She knew that. She'd known it since she was old enough to understand what her grandfather owed, and to whom. She let herself know it for exactly as long as it took to name it. Then she set it aside and thought about what needed doing in the morning. That was how you got through things, not by pretending they weren't heavy, by picking them up anyway and deciding where to put them down. She was up before 4. Not because she'd set herself to wake at a particular hour, she didn't own a clock precise enough for that, but because her body had apparently decided that sleep was no longer a reasonable use of the time available. She lay in the dark for about 10 minutes trying to will herself back under, and when that didn't work, she got up, built the fire from the coals, and put the water on. Silas had slept on the floor near the hearth, which he'd done before at Holt's invitation, and apparently saw no reason to treat differently now. He was awake when she came out, sitting up with his back against the wall and his hat already on, which she suspected meant he'd slept in it. "You sleep at all?" she asked. "Some," he said, which from Silas meant yes. She made the coffee strong and they drank it standing up, because sitting down felt wrong given what the morning required. She went over the documents once more while the light came gray and thin through the east window, checking her handwriting against the originals, making sure the dates were copied exactly. A single error in the transcription would give Granger's lawyer something to argue about, and she didn't intend to give him anything. "The land agent in Harwick," she said. "Do you know him?" "Prentice," Silas said. "Been there about 4 years, came down from the north. He's not Granger's man." "How sure are you?" Silas considered this with his usual economy of expression. "Sure enough to bring your papers to him," he said. "Not sure enough to count on what he does with them." That was honest. It was also the best she was going to get. Ada arrived at first light, which meant Ada had been writing in the dark, which meant Silas had gotten her the message faster than Ivy had asked for, and Ada had not wasted time once she received it. She came in, looked at the document spread on the table, looked at Ivy, and said, "Have you eaten anything?" "Coffee," Ivy said. "That's not eating," Ada said, and went to the kitchen shelf and found the oats without being told where they were, which was Ada's particular brand of capable that never quite asked permission. Ivy let her. She was grateful for it, actually, in the way you're grateful for things you hadn't thought to provide for yourself. They ate standing, quickly, and then Ivy folded the documents into the oilskin pouch she used for important papers when she had to travel in uncertain weather, and the three of them went out into the morning. The ride down to Harwick was cold and clear, the kind of winter morning that looked beautiful and felt brutal, with a sky the pale color of ice and a wind coming off the upper ridge that cut through every layer. The road had frozen overnight, which meant it was faster, but harder on the horses. Ivy kept her pace steady and her mind on what she was going to say when she got there. She'd been through the argument so many times in the last 6 hours that it had lost the feeling of argument and become something more like structure, a shape she could navigate by feel. Original document date versus altered copy date. Interest escalation triggered by a deadline that had been moved without notice or agreement. At least 7 properties on the slope affected by the same pattern. A pattern consistent with a deliberate scheme, not clerical error. The key word was deliberate. She needed Prentice to hear that word and not dismiss it. They reached Harwick just after 8 in the morning. The main street was quiet, the early cold keeping most people inside, but there were tracks in the frozen mud that suggested horses tied and moved in the last hour. Ivy noticed this and filed it without reacting. The Territorial Land Office was a narrow building wedged between the hotel and the dry goods, with a sign that needed repainting and a window too small to let in adequate light. The office kept morning hours only in winter. Prentice was there by 8 and gone by noon, which was part of why the timing mattered. She tied the roan at the post and went in. Prentice was a medium-sized man of about 50, with a methodical quality to his movements that suggested a person who liked order and was perhaps in the wrong territory for it. He was sorting a stack of papers when they came in, and he looked up with the expression of a man bracing for whatever the day was about to bring. "Miss Rowan," he said. He knew her by sight. She'd been in twice about the loan documents since Holt died. "Mr. Prentice," she said, "I need to file a counterdocument to an emergency acquisition claim." He set down his papers. "Which claim?" "Victor Granger filed yesterday, or is planning to file today, an emergency acquisition claim on at least one property in the mountain corridor above Harwick," she said. "Possibly more than one." She opened the oilskin pouch and laid the documents on his counter in the order she'd arranged them. "These are the original loan documents showing the agreed terms. These are copies of what Granger's operation filed with the escalation clause trigger. The date on the deadline in the filed copy is 4 months earlier than the date in the original signed agreement." Prentice looked at the documents without picking them up. He was reading them from where he stood, and she watched his eyes move across the pages with the careful attention of a man whose job required him to read documents accurately. He picked up the original. He picked up the copy. He held them side by side. The silence in the room was the kind that meant something was happening behind someone's face that hadn't come out yet. "These are both meant to represent the same document?" he said. "Yes," she said. "And this?" He indicated the date discrepancy with one finger, not touching either page. "A 4-month difference," she said, "in a year when a late frost destroyed the vegetable crop. The shorter deadline made it structurally impossible for my grandfather to make the payment that would have prevented the escalation clause from triggering." Prentice set both documents down and looked at her. "Miss Rowan, I can't make a determination about fraud on the basis of—" "I'm not asking you to make a determination," she said. "I'm asking you to place these documents on record as a counterfiling to whatever Granger submits. That's within your authority." He blinked. "It is," he said slowly. "And a counterfiling on record requires that any proceeding based on Granger's claim be paused for review before any action can be taken on the property," she said. "That's also within your authority." Behind her, Ada was quiet, which was Ada's way of supporting without interfering. Silas had stayed outside with the horses, which was Silas's way of expressing confidence without participating. Prentice looked at the documents again. Then he looked at Ivy with the particular expression of a man who is deciding how much trouble he wants to be in today. "There are 7 families on the slope with loans from Granger's operation," Ivy said quietly. "If the pattern in these documents holds across the other properties, and I have reason to believe it does, then what you're looking at is not a collection of individual defaults. It's a coordinated effort to manufacture defaults on a specific set of properties that happen to align with the projected rail corridor right-of-way." The word she'd saved. She put it down now carefully, in the silence, where Prentice could pick it up and turn it over. Coordinated. Looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and opened his filing ledger. "I'll need your full name and your relation to the primary loan holder," he said. She gave them to him. She stood straight and steady while he wrote, and she didn't let herself feel relief yet, because relief was for after. He stamped the documents, wrote the filing date across the top in his careful hand, and placed them in the intake stack. He looked up. "This creates a hold on any property acquisition proceeding tied to these documents for a minimum of 14 days pending review," he said. "I want to be clear that this doesn't resolve the underlying claim." "I understand," she said. 14 days is what I need." He nodded slowly. He looked like a man who had just done something that might create problems for him and had decided it was the right thing anyway. Ivy recognized that expression. She'd worn it herself a few times. She thanked him and went out. Ada was 3 steps behind her. Outside on the boardwalk in the cold, Ada put a hand briefly on Ivy's arm, just for a moment, the way Ada expressed things she wasn't going to say, and then dropped it and said, "Now what?" "Now we wait for Cole," Ivy said. "And if Granger figures out what you just did before Cole gets back?" Ivy untied the roan and looked down the main street. 3 doors down, outside the Long Bench Saloon, there was a horse tied that she hadn't seen on the way in, a big gray with a city saddle and a brand she didn't recognize. Expensive animal, not a working horse, not a local horse. "Then we deal with that when it happens," she said, and swung up into the saddle. She found out 2 days later that it had already happened. Granger came to her door in the early afternoon, alone this time, which was more unsettling than if he'd brought his riders. A man who comes alone has already decided he doesn't need backup, which means he thinks the situation is already decided. He knocked this time. She gave him credit for that. She opened the door and looked at him and waited. "Miss Rowan," he said. "May I come in?" "No," she said, pleasantly. The way he'd been pleasant to her on the Harwick street. Something in his face adjusted. Not offense, he was too controlled for offense, but a recalibration, like a scale shifting to account for unexpected weight. "I've heard you filed a counter-document with Prentice," he said. "You heard correctly," she said. "That was a resourceful thing to do," he said. His voice was still pleasant. His eyes were doing their card player calculation. "But I think you may have acted on incomplete information." "My information seems fairly complete," she said. "The date discrepancy you identified," he said. "I believe that's a clerical error. The kind of thing that happens when documents are copied by hand across multiple offices. I'm sure if we sit down and compare the originals—" "I have the originals," she said. "Holt kept everything." A small pause. "Of course," Granger said. "Then you know that the debt itself is valid," she said. "Yes. I know the debt is valid. I'm not disputing the debt, Mr. Granger. I'm disputing the manufactured timeline designed to make it impossible to service." He looked at her for a moment. The pleasantness had thinned slightly, not gone, but stretched, like fabric pulled too tight. "You're a young woman managing a difficult situation," he said, and she could hear in it the particular condescension that dressed itself as sympathy. "I understand the instinct to look for explanations that aren't simply the hard facts of the situation, but the facts are what they are, and a counterfiling with Prentice buys you 2 weeks, not a solution." "2 weeks is enough," she said. "Enough for what?" he said. And there was something in the question, a genuine curiosity, she thought, about what a 23-year-old woman on a mountain homestead thought she could accomplish in 14 days. She looked at him. She thought about how much to say and decided on exactly as much as she wanted him to know, and not one word more. "Enough to establish that this isn't an isolated situation," she said. "Once a pattern is documented across multiple properties, it stops being a collection of individual debt claims and starts being something the Territorial Commissioner's Office takes an interest in." He was quiet for a moment. The pleasant face had gone still. "And if you had," she said, "documentation. From someone who had been inside the operation. Company records, ledgers, internal correspondence showing that the timeline manipulation was not a clerical error but a policy." She paused. "What would you call that?" Granger looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger. Something more careful than anger. "Is Cole here?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "No," she said, truthfully. He studied her. She held his gaze with the same steadiness she'd held it on the Harwick street, the same steadiness Holt had modeled across 40 years of dealing with people who thought they had more power than they deserved. "You should think carefully about what you're doing," Granger said. His voice had changed. Still controlled, but the pleasantness was gone now, and what replaced it wasn't quite a threat but lived in the same building. "The Mercer Board has resources you don't. The railroad interests have connections in this territory that go further than a land commissioner's counterfiling. I have been doing this for a long time, Miss Rowan, and I have never had a 23-year-old mountain girl stand between me and a completed acquisition." "That's probably why it keeps working," she said. He blinked. "Because the people in the path of it are isolated," she said. "They don't know what the others are dealing with. They don't compare notes. They don't look at each other's documents and see the same date moved by the same 4 months. She kept her voice level. "They're alone, and being alone makes it easier to convince people that their situation is their own fault and not something being done to them." Granger was very still. "We're not alone anymore," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat on and stepped back from the door. I'll be in Harwick, he said. If Cole Mercer wants to have a conversation, he knows where to find me. I'll let him know, she said. She shut the door. She stood behind it and listened to his footsteps cross the porch, listened to the horse move out of the yard, and then stood in her own kitchen and breathed carefully for a moment, the way you breathe when you've been holding yourself very still under pressure and can finally let the effort show. Her hands were not shaking. She was slightly surprised by this. She went to the table and sat down and wrote a note to Ada, summarizing the conversation, and sent it with a neighbor boy who sometimes ran messages for a penny. Then she went out to the barn and did the afternoon chores with the focused physical attention that manual work required, because manual work had always been her best thinking environment, and she had a great deal to think about. Granger's reaction to the word documentation had told her something important. He hadn't dismissed it. He hadn't said there were no records that could matter. He'd gone still, which was the response of a man who knew exactly what records existed and was calculating how much trouble they could cause. That meant Fletcher's ledgers were real and they were significant. That meant Cole getting them to Pendleton was not a contingency. It was the pivot the whole thing turned on. 5 days to Pendleton, he'd said. He'd left 6 days ago. She counted back. He should be there now, or close. She was pulling hay down for the goats when she heard the horse on the lower track, and she made herself stay with the hay for a moment before she looked, because she had been listening for a particular horse on that track for 6 days, and she didn't want to perform hope in front of herself. She looked. The blaze, the crooked white mark like a lightning bolt, and the way the animal carried its head slightly right. Cole. She set the hay fork down and walked out of the barn. He looked worse than when he'd left, which she hadn't thought was possible. He was carrying the kind of exhaustion that had gone past the point where sleep would immediately fix it, the kind you saw in a person when they'd been moving hard for too many days in a row. He had mud on his coat from the knees down and ice in the crease of his hat and a saddlebag on the left side that was heavier than it had been when he left. He stopped the horse at the gate and looked at her, and before she could say anything about Granger or Prentice or the 14-day hold, he said, I got them. Everything Fletcher had. 3 years of ledgers and the original contract files showing the acquisition terms as they were actually agreed versus what was filed. She breathed out. Pendleton? Commissioner's office, he said. A man named Aldrich. He's been trying to build a case against railroad land manipulation for 2 years, apparently, and has had nothing concrete enough to move on. He swung down from the horse with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body was protesting the movement. Fletcher's records were concrete enough. What does Aldrich need now? Corroboration, Cole said. The ledgers show the pattern but don't name names at the local level. He needs witnesses, people who signed the original documents and can testify to the discrepancy between what they signed and what was filed. She looked at him. I have 6 families who will do that. He stopped, looked back at her. 7, counting Harlan Doyle, she said. Something moved across his face. Relief, she thought, and something past relief that she didn't name. How did you get Doyle, he said. Ada Pruitt, she said. You convinced Ada Pruitt to go to Harlan Doyle's door. She volunteered, Ivy said. More or less. Cole looked at her with the full weight of that expression she'd seen twice before. The one that appeared when she'd done something he hadn't expected and he was deciding what to do with not having expected it. Then he let it go and led the horse toward the barn, and she walked beside him, and he said, Granger's going to push back hard when Aldrich files. Granger came here 2 days ago, she said. Cole stopped walking. What did he say? She told him. She gave him the conversation accurately, in full, including the shift in Granger's voice when she'd used the word documentation and the way his face had gone still. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, He's scared. I know, she said. Scared people do faster things than careful people. I know that too, she said, which is why the timing matters. Aldrich needs to move before Granger can regroup. Cole was quiet for a moment. They were in the barn now, and she took the saddlebag, heavy, full of papers, while he untacked, and they worked in the comfortable efficiency that had developed between them without being decided on, the natural choreography of 2 people who'd spent enough days in proximity to stop working around each other. There's something I didn't tell you in the note, he said. She waited. Aldrich asked me to appear in Harwick, he said, in person, publicly. He wants to conduct the counter proceeding as a public hearing rather than a private filing, because Granger has connections in the private filing channels, and a public hearing creates a record that can't be quietly reassigned. He set the saddle over the rail and turned to face her. Which means Granger finds out I'm alive and here and contesting this. All of it. The acquisition, the document fraud, the board's activities. He already knows you're alive, she said. He asked me if you were here. Knowing and having it public are different things, Cole said. If I appear in a public hearing, the board knows exactly where I am and what I have. They'll move to challenge the trust structure, probably file their own counterclaims. Can they win those claims? She said. He considered. Not quickly, he said, and maybe not at all if Aldrich moves fast enough. Then that's the answer, she said. It's not without risk, he said. She looked at him steadily. Cole, everything in this situation has risk. The question is whether we move or whether Granger does, and if we let Granger move first, these families lose their land. He was watching her. She could see him working through it, not the logic of it, which she knew he'd already worked through on the road back from Pendleton, but something else. Something about the shape of the decision and what it meant. If I do this, he said, it puts Eli in a different position. He's not the son of a man who walked away anymore. He's the son of a man who came back and made noise. He's the son of a man who did the right thing, she said. That's not a worse position. Cole looked at the floor of the barn for a moment. Then he looked at her. The lamp threw its circle of light between them, and outside the mountain was quiet and dark. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. His voice was different, lower, without the controlled layer on top. She waited. I keep thinking about Eli saying she's cold. Her ears are cold, he said. About this kid who has been dragged around for 2 years and watched his father avoid every situation that could have mattered, and he still just... He stopped. He just pays attention to what's in front of him and does what he can for it. Ivy was quiet. He's 5, Cole said. I know, she said. He's better at it than I've been, Cole said. She didn't argue. She also didn't let him use it as a place to stay. Well, she said, you're working on it. Something in his face shifted. Not a smile, not exactly, but the territory adjacent to one, warmer than amusement. He held it for a moment, and then it settled into something quieter and more permanent looking. I'll send word to Aldrich in the morning, he said. I'll agree to the public hearing. I'll get word to Ada about the witnesses, she said. She'll have everyone in Harwick assembled by the time Granger figures out what's happening. You're sure they'll come? She thought about Tom Lester's face when he'd seen the date discrepancy, about the Harriman brothers going hard and quiet, about Harlan Doyle saying they took my belongings out of the house in the snow like it was trash. They'll come, she said. They went inside. Cole sat at the table with the saddlebag of documents and began sorting through them, organizing, marking, the methodical preparation of someone building a case he intended to make well. Ivy made coffee and put the pot on and sat across from him and did her own work, writing down in order every date and figure from Holt's original payment records that supported the counter-narrative. They worked for 2 hours without saying much. The fire held steady. The mountain was quiet outside. Occasionally one of them would ask the other a specific question, a date, a name, the exact wording of a particular clause. And the other would answer, and the silence would close back over again, a working silence, not an uncomfortable one. At some point, Cole looked up from what he was reading and said, without preamble, "You could have sent word through Silas when Granger came here, told me what happened, and let me decide how to respond." "I know," she said. "You handled it yourself instead." "You were 5 days away," she said, "and I knew what to say." "I know you did," he said. He wasn't criticizing her. She understood that. He was saying something else. He stopped, started again. "I've spent 2 years making sure nobody else was carrying any of this. I'm not sure when that stopped being possible." She looked up from the documents. He was looking at her with an openness she'd seen before, only in the moments when he was too tired to manage it away. "I think it stopped being possible the night we ate bean soup in a blizzard," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's probably accurate," he said. She went back to her writing. He went back to his. The lamp burned steady between them, and outside the stars were sharp and cold over the mountain, and in 5 days the public hearing would happen and Granger would be in the room, and the thing that had been building since a desperate cowboy knocked on a stranger's door in a snowstorm would come to its point. But that was 5 days from now. Tonight there was work to do, and they were doing it, and the north wall was quiet, and the cabin was warm, and that was enough. The 5 days did not pass quietly. Granger moved the morning after his visit to Ivy's door, which told her he'd already sensed the ground shifting under him and decided that speed was better than patience. He filed 3 additional acquisition claims through the Harwick Land Office before Prentice arrived at 8, filed them through a deputy who apparently had a different set of loyalties than Prentice himself, targeting the Harriman brothers' timber operation, Tom Lester's cattle claim, and a narrow strip of Caswell's creekside acreage that happened to sit directly in the path of the projected rail grade. Ada sent word by 6 in the morning. Ivy was already dressed. She rode to the Harriman brothers first, because they were the most likely to respond badly and the most likely to do something that would complicate the legal picture if they felt cornered. She found them in their yard looking at a notice that had been tacked to their gate sometime in the night, and the elder Harriman, a large, quiet man named Burl, who communicated primarily through the angle of his jaw, was holding it in both hands with the particular stillness of a person who is deciding between several responses, not all of them advisable. "Don't do anything with that yet," Ivy said before she was fully off the horse. Burl looked at her. "I know what it says," she said, "and I know it feels like the time to respond directly. It isn't. The hearing is in 4 days. If you respond to this notice in any way that Granger can characterize as obstruction or aggression, he uses it to muddy the record before Aldrich arrives." "So we do nothing," Burl said. His voice was flat. "You do nothing visible," she said. "You gather every document you have, you write down every conversation you've had with Granger's representatives and the date it happened, and you be in Harwick on Thursday morning, ready to say it out loud in front of witnesses." He held the notice for another moment. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and said, "All right." She spent the next 2 days doing versions of that same conversation. Tom Lester was easier. He was frightened for his family in a way that made him careful rather than combative, and careful was what the situation needed. Caswell said almost nothing, just nodded, and she trusted the nod because Caswell had never said a thing he didn't mean. Harlan Doyle had already written down everything from memory in a surprisingly clear hand and had it waiting for her when she arrived, which she suspected had something to do with Ada and declined to investigate. Cole spent those days at the table with Fletcher's ledgers, building the case document by document with the methodical focus of someone who had once run a significant company and remembered how to make evidence legible to people who needed to be persuaded rather than convinced. He was good at it. She watched him work across the evenings, the way he moved through the numbers without getting lost in them, the way he could identify which entry mattered and which was noise. And she thought about what he'd said about his father building the company honestly and him trying to honor that, and she thought it showed. Somewhere in the way he worked, in the specific care he brought to making the record accurate rather than just favorable, she could see what he'd been before he'd had to become something more careful and defended. On the second evening, he looked up from the ledgers and said, "There are 11 properties in the corridor, not 7. She set down what she was writing. 11? "There are 4 more on the south-facing slope that I hadn't identified," he said. "The acquisition attempts on those are further along. 2 of them have already had their escalation clauses triggered and are in active foreclosure. Those families may not even know they're in the same pattern as the mountain properties." "Who are they?" He named them. She recognized 2 of the names, Valley families lower down, people she'd seen at the Harwick market but didn't know well. People who wouldn't have compared notes with the mountain families because there was no natural reason for them to be in the same conversation. "Can we reach them before Thursday?" she said. "Not all of them," he said, "but if we can get word to 1 or 2, and if they come, Aldrich needs to see the full scope of it. 7 mountain families is a significant pattern. 11 properties across both slopes is harder to dismiss as coincidence or clerical error." She thought for a moment. "Silas," she said. Cole looked at her. "He knows every trail on this mountain and 4 mountains over," she said. "If anyone can reach the valley properties in 2 days, he can." She sent word to Silas that night. By morning he was gone, moving south along routes that Granger's riders didn't know well enough to intercept, carrying brief letters in Ivy's handwriting explaining what was happening and what Thursday required. The night before the hearing, Cole came in from the barn late, later than the work required, and she understood that he'd needed the time outside and didn't ask about it. He sat at the table and she poured him coffee, and they sat for a while in the way they'd learned to sit. Not in silence exactly, but in the kind of company that didn't require constant filling. After a while he said, "I've been thinking about what comes after." She waited. "If Aldrich rules in our favor, and I believe he will, given what we're bringing, the acquisition proceedings stop. The families keep their land. The rail company has to negotiate legitimate right-of-way agreements rather than manufactured foreclosures." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Granger loses his operation here. The board loses their method, at least in this territory. It doesn't undo everything they've done elsewhere." "No," she said. "It doesn't." "It might be enough to prompt a broader investigation," he said. "Fletcher's records cover 3 territories, not just this one. Aldrich could refer the pattern upward." He paused. "Or he might not. He might contain it here because containing it here is as far as his authority runs." "Then we make sure it gets referred upward," she said. "If Aldrich won't do it, we find someone who will." He looked at her. "That's a longer fight than Thursday." "I know," she said. "I'm not sure." He stopped. Started again more carefully. "I walked away from this once because I ran out of road. I had a newborn and a company fighting me and no effective allies, and I couldn't find a point of leverage that held." He looked at the table. "I'm not sure I walked away for entirely honorable reasons, if I'm being honest. I told myself it was for Eli. Part of it was. Part of it was that I was tired and grieving, and it was easier to leave than to keep failing." She absorbed this. She didn't offer him a simpler version of it. "You came back," she said. "I came back because Granger followed me here, and I didn't have the option of—" He stopped. "That's not why you came back," she said. Not accusatory, just accurate. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It isn't." She didn't push him past that. It was enough that he'd said it, and she thought he knew she understood what it meant, and saying more would have made it smaller rather than larger. "The trust," she said. "Her voting interest in the company. After Thursday, what happens to it?" "I've been thinking about that too," he said. "The board needs my signature to dissolve it or transfer it. I'm not going to give them that, but I could restructure it, work with a lawyer I actually trust this time, to make it function as a block on the kind of acquisition activities they've been pursuing. Not a controlling interest, but a persistent one. A splinter they can't remove without a legal challenge they'd rather avoid, especially after Aldrich's ruling is on record." "You'd have to stay involved," she said. "At least enough to manage it." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "I can manage it from here," he said. "If here's an option." The lamp was steady between them and the fire was low and the mountain was absolutely quiet outside. She heard what he was saying, all of it, the layered meaning under the practical language. And she thought about 8 months of living in a cabin that had felt like a held breath, and 2.5 days of a blizzard that had felt more alive than the 8 months before it, and the specific way a person's absence could be louder than their presence if you weren't careful. "Here's an option," she said. He nodded once. Not the nod of someone who'd gotten what they wanted. The nod of someone who'd said something true and had it received truthfully and was still sitting with the weight of that. They went to bed at separate reasonable hours like reasonable people, and Ivy lay in her room in the dark and thought about the hearing in the morning and the families on the slope and the documents in Cole's saddlebag and the question of what Aldrich was actually like. And underneath all of that, quieter and more persistent, the thing Cole had said, "If here's an option." She slept better than she had any night that week. Thursday arrived gray and cold and entirely indifferent to what it meant. They rode down together. Ada was already in Harwick when they arrived, had been there since before dawn, Ivy suspected, doing the kind of advance work that Ada did best, which involved talking to everyone and making sure the information in circulation was the information she'd put there. The Long Bench Saloon had been requisitioned as the hearing space, which was standard practice for any proceeding requiring a crowd. And by the time Ivy and Cole arrived, there were already more people gathered outside it than she'd expected. Not just the mountain families, valley people too. People she recognized from the Harwick market, from the road, from the peripheral social connections that constituted knowing someone in a small territory without knowing them well. Tom Lester's wife was there with both children. The Harriman brothers stood at the edge of the gathering like 2 large, patient boulders. Caswell had come with his son, who Ivy hadn't seen in 2 years. And standing slightly apart from the main group with the careful posture of a man who was unaccustomed to being in the same place as a woman he'd spent 35 years avoiding, was Harlan Doyle. Ada was standing 6 feet from him, talking to someone else, and every few minutes they would not quite look at each other in a way that was almost more visible than looking. Silas had made it back. He was at the edge of the group with 2 people Ivy didn't know, a middle-aged woman and a younger man, Valley families from the South Slope, which meant he'd reached at least 2 of the 4 additional properties before the hearing. She felt something loosen in her chest when she saw them. Commissioner Aldrich had arrived from Pendleton the previous evening. He was younger than she'd pictured from Cole's description, perhaps 40, with a direct manner and the slightly worn look of someone who handled bureaucratic obstruction as a regular part of his job and had reached a detached peace with it. He'd set up at the long table at the back of the saloon with 2 assistants and a stack of files, and when Cole walked in, Aldrich stood and extended a hand with the specific relief of a man who had been told something was coming and was glad to see it arrive. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I'd begun to wonder." "I said I'd be here," Cole said. Aldrich looked at Ivy, who had come in beside Cole and showed no intention of going anywhere else. Cole said, "This is Ivy Rowan. Her property is the primary claim in Granger's initial filing, and she's the one who got your counterfiling into Prentice's office in time to create the hold." Aldrich looked at her with a reassessment that she recognized and was used to. "Miss Rowan," he said, "I owe you a considerable debt of timing." "You can repay it by ruling correctly," she said. He almost smiled. "That's the plan," he said. Granger arrived 20 minutes before the hearing opened. He came in with 2 men who wore the clothing of lawyers, city-cut coats, document cases, the particular upright posture of people paid to represent positions rather than hold them. He saw Cole immediately, which was inevitable in the crowded room, and something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, because Granger wasn't the kind of man who let himself be visibly surprised. A recognition, a recalculation happening in real time. He crossed to where Cole was standing. Ivy was beside him, and she stayed where she was. "Cole," Granger said. His voice was controlled. The pleasant surface was back but thinner now, worn by the last week's friction. "Victor," Cole said. "I'd like to speak with you before this begins," Granger said. "There may be room for a resolution that doesn't require a public proceeding." "There isn't," Cole said. Simply. Not with anger. Anger would have made it negotiable, just as a fact. Granger looked at Ivy. She could see him trying to calculate whether she was the leverage point or the obstacle, and arriving at the correct conclusion that she was neither, that she was simply present and not going anywhere. "You understand what you're doing," Granger said to Cole. "Once this is public, the board can do whatever they decide to do," Cole said. "I've been managing that concern for 3 years. I'm done letting it be the reason I don't act." Granger looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked around the room, at the gathered families, at Aldrich's table with its stacked files, at Ada Pruitt, who had materialized nearby with the interested attention of a woman who was absolutely listening to every word and intended to remember all of it. He looked at Silas and the 2 Valley families Silas had brought. "You have more people than I expected," Granger said, quietly. It wasn't addressed to either of them specifically. "Yes," Ivy said. "We do." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went to find his lawyers. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Aldrich ran it with a thoroughness that Ivy respected. He didn't rush, didn't allow theatrics, didn't let either side turn it into something performative. He went through the documents methodically, Fletcher's ledgers against the acquisition filings, the original signed agreements against the copies Granger had filed, the payment records against the escalation clause triggers. He called witnesses one at a time and let them speak in plain language, and he asked follow-up questions that were precise and unglamorous and covered exactly what needed covering. Tom Lester was the first witness. He was nervous. She could see it in the way he held his hands, but he knew what he'd signed and what had been filed and the difference between them, and he said it clearly. The elder Harriman, Burrell, was the 5th. He'd brought the notice that had been tacked to his gate in the night, which he laid on the table in front of Aldrich without comment, and the silence in the room as Aldrich read it was its own kind of testimony. Harlan Doyle was called 7th. He was 70 years old, and he walked to the front of the room with the dignity of a man who had been treated as disposable and had decided that that said more about the people who'd done it than about himself. He sat down and folded his hands on the table and told Aldrich exactly what had happened when Granger's men came to his door. The collar, the belongings in the snow, the dog barking, the 41 years the oak tree. And he said it without drama, in the plain sequence of events. And that plainness was exactly what made the room go very quiet while he talked. Granger's lawyers objected 3 times. Aldrich overruled twice and sustained once, and the sustained objection was a procedural point that didn't change the substance of anything. Cole testified last on the main proceeding. He'd been clear with Ivy that morning about what he intended to say and how, and she'd listened and suggested 2 changes in framing, and he'd taken both. And she'd thought then what she thought now watching him at the front of the room, that he was better at this than he'd given himself credit for. He was precise, he was calm. He acknowledged without apology that he'd been inside the operation and had documentation of its deliberate design. And when Granger's lead lawyer tried to characterize his departure from the company as evidence of unreliability, Cole said quietly, "I left because I disagreed with what the company was doing. I'm here because I still do. Those are consistent positions, not contradictory ones." The lawyer didn't have a useful answer for that. When it was over, when Aldrich had heard everything and thanked the witnesses and called a recess to compile his ruling, the room released the particular tension that had been building in it for 4 hours, and people started talking all at once, the way people do when they've been holding their breath collectively and finally stop. Ivy was standing near the back wall when Ada came to stand beside her. "How do you think it went?" Ada asked. "I think it went the way it needed to," Ivy said. "Whether that's enough for Aldrich to rule fully in our favor, I don't know." "I do," Ada said. Ivy looked at her. "I've been watching men make decisions in this territory for 40 years, Ada said. Aldrich made his decision about 2 hours in when he read the date discrepancy on the Doyle loan document for the second time and wrote something down on his own paper. When a man writes something down on his own paper in a hearing like this, he's already decided. He's just working out the language." Ivy absorbed this. She looked across the room to where Cole was standing with Aldrich's assistant, answering a question about the Fletcher ledger structure. He looked tired in the deep way he'd been tired since he got back from Pendleton. But underneath it, there was something different, a kind of settled quality that hadn't been there before, like a man who had been carrying a bag for a long time and had finally put it down somewhere appropriate. She thought, this is what he looks like when he's not running. She filed that away. Aldrich's ruling came 90 minutes later. He read it standing, without theatrics, in the same direct manner he'd conducted the entire proceeding. He found that the documents filed by Granger's operation in support of the acquisition claims showed material discrepancies from the original signed agreements, specifically in the deadline terms triggering the escalation clauses. He found that these discrepancies followed a consistent pattern across multiple properties indicating deliberate rather than accidental alteration. He suspended all pending acquisition proceedings on affected properties in the Harwick Mountain Corridor, pending a full territorial investigation. He referred the documentation to the Territorial Land Commission in the capital with a recommendation for expanded review covering the other territories where Fletcher's ledgers showed similar activity. He looked up from the paper at the end and said, in a tone slightly removed from the formal register, "The families present who hold claims on the affected properties should know that the suspension is effective immediately. No action can be taken on any of those properties while the investigation is open." The room did not erupt. These were mountain people, valley people, people who had learned not to celebrate things before they were fully in hand. But there was a sound, not quite a sound, more like the quality of the air changing. And Tom Lester sat down suddenly as though his legs had made the decision without consulting him, and his wife put her hand on his shoulder and left it there. Harlan Doyle looked at the table in front of him for a moment. Then he looked up and across the room and found Ada Pruitt, and she was already looking at him. Neither of them did anything about it. They didn't need to. Granger and his lawyers were gone before Aldrich finished reading. She didn't see them leave. No one did exactly. But when she looked toward where they'd been standing, there was only an empty space and a chair pushed back at an angle. She thought about what it meant that a man like Granger left quietly, and she decided it meant he was already calculating the next approach, which was its own kind of information. This wasn't over everywhere. It was over here, for now, and now was what they had, and it would have to be enough. She would watch for him. They all would. Cole found her outside on the boardwalk where she'd stepped to get away from the noise inside and find some cold air. He came out and stood beside her, and they looked at the main street of Harwick in the winter afternoon light, the storefronts, and the frozen mud, and the horses at the post, and the whole ordinary infrastructure of a small territory town going about its business. Aldrich referred it upward, Cole said. I heard, she said. That was the part I wasn't certain about, he said. I knew he'd rule in our favor here. I didn't know if he'd have the appetite for the broader referral. He did, she said. He did, Cole agreed. A moment of quiet. I need to send for Eli, Cole said. She felt something shift in her chest at the name, not sadness, almost the opposite. How soon can he be here? A week if I send word today, Cole said. The woman in Caldwell will put him on a coach if I send the fare. Send today, she said. He looked at her sidelong. The goats need someone to check on them properly, she said. I've been doing my best, but I'm not Eli. He made the sound she'd been waiting to hear him make for weeks. Not quite a laugh, but the thing that lived just before a laugh, the breath of it. She'd begun to think it might not be in him, that the loss and the 2 years of moving had pressed it out of reach. She was glad to find she was wrong. Murph would agree with you, he said. Murph has standards, she said. They stood on the boardwalk while the town moved around them, and she thought about all the things the next months would require. The investigation, the trust restructuring, whatever the Mercer board decided to do in response to Aldrich's referral, the work of rebuilding a homestead that had been operating below capacity since March. None of it was resolved. Most of it was only just beginning. That was the part people didn't talk about much, the way solving one set of problems mostly just revealed the next set waiting behind them. But she was 23 and the land was hers, and the filing was on record, and Cole Mercer was standing beside her in the cold, with something settled in his face that hadn't been there when he first knocked on her door. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. Inside, Ada had apparently organized an impromptu gathering that was halfway to becoming a celebration, whether the Mountain families were comfortable with that word or not, because there was noise and movement visible through the long bench window, and she could hear Ada's voice above all of it, which meant Ada had taken charge of the narrative of the afternoon and would be managing it efficiently for the foreseeable future. We should go back in, Cole said. In a minute, she said. He didn't push. He understood about needing a minute. She looked at the sky above the mountain, the pale winter blue of it, the clouds moving in off the western ridge in long, slow formations, the way the light sat low and clear over everything. She thought about Holt sitting in his chair with his boots on, 31 acres, and a tin box full of careful records and a gap in the north wall he'd never quite gotten around to fixing. She thought about what it meant to spend 40 years building something and have it threatened by a man with a document and a manufactured deadline. She thought about 8 months of alone, and how the alone had been necessary, had been the thing that showed her she could manage when she had to. She thought about the fact that you could spend years being capable and careful and self-sufficient, and still find that those qualities were different from being known, that surviving a thing and choosing a thing were not the same activity, that the door she'd opened in the blizzard, the actual door, the one with the draft coming under it, was not the last door she'd opened that night. Holt would have liked you, she said. Cole was quiet for a moment. What makes you say that? He respected people who did what needed doing without making a production of it, she said. He didn't have much patience for performance. He said it was a waste of everyone's time. She paused. He would have had questions about the company, the freight business. He would have asked them directly and listened to the actual answers and made up his own mind. Would he have liked what he found? She considered this, honestly, the way she tried to consider everything. He would have liked that you came back, she said. He always said it was easy to know what a person was made of when things were going well. You found out when they had a reason to go a different direction, and they didn't. Cole absorbed this. She felt him absorb it, felt the quality of the silence change. You should know, he said carefully, that I'm not going to be easy to have around. He stopped. I have habits from 2 years of moving that are going to take time to undo. I check the ridge. I sleep light. I don't talk about things as readily as I probably should. Eli is the easiest part of, and even he has learned some of my worse habits. Eli is 5 and he checks on sick animals without being asked, she said. His habits seem fine. He got those from his mother, Cole said. His voice was even. The evenness took effort. He got them from somewhere good, she said. That counts. A silence. Then, Margaret would have said something useful about all of this. She was the one who knew what to say. I usually knew what to do, and she usually knew what to say, and between us we managed. He paused. I've been doing both for 2 years, and I'm not as good at the saying part. You're better than you think, Ivy said. He didn't argue. That was progress, she thought. She pushed off the boardwalk post and straightened her coat and said, Let's go back in before Ada restructures the entire social order of Harwick without us. He made that almost laugh sound again, and they went inside. The weeks that followed were nothing like simple. The territorial investigation moved at the pace of official processes, which is to say slowly and with many requests for additional documentation and several letters from lawyers representing the Mercer board that Cole handled with a patience Ivy found more impressive the more she watched it. The board challenged the trust structure as predicted. 2 of their challenges were dismissed on procedural grounds. The third was more serious and required Cole to spend 3 days in Pendleton with Aldrich and a lawyer named Marsh who had exactly the qualifications and temperament the situation required and charged accordingly, and it was worth it. Eli arrived on a Thursday, 9 days after Cole sent the fare. He came off the Caldwell coach wrapped in the same impossible quantity of scarves, serious as always, with a small bag and a carved wooden horse that he carried with the care of something precious. He looked at Ivy on the platform with those enormous dark eyes, and he said very directly, Is Murph still all right? Come see for yourself, she said. He followed her to the wagon like this was exactly the correct answer, which it was. He stayed. They all stayed. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It happened incrementally, the way most true decisions do, through the accumulation of ordinary days rather than a single moment. Cole repaired the fence along the south boundary properly, with new posts and wire, a job that took 4 days and was done right. Ivy showed Eli how to test the ice on the water trough each morning, and he took this responsibility with a seriousness that suggested he understood responsibility was something you showed up for every day, not once. They ate meals together, the 3 of them, and the meals were mostly unremarkable, which turned out to be exactly what remarkable felt like when you'd been without it for a while. The investigation produced findings by early spring that resulted in the suspension of Granger's acquisition operations across 2 territories and formal charges related to document alteration filed against 3 individuals in the operation, one of whom was a lawyer who had apparently been handling the copies. Granger himself was not charged. He had, characteristically, kept his own hands clean enough that the documentary evidence pointed to his operation without pointing specifically at him. But the suspension of his authority meant he was done in this territory, and Aldrich's referral upward meant he would spend the following years under a scrutiny he'd never previously experienced. It wasn't justice in the complete sense. Ivy knew that. She'd sat with Aldrich's final report long enough to understand all the things it did and didn't accomplish, all the edges where the outcome was ambiguous, and the places where the harm had already been done and the ruling couldn't reach backward to undo it. Harlan Doyle's oak tree was still standing. His belongings had been retrieved from the snow, and he'd moved back in. But the violation of it, the specific contempt embedded in the act of men who did not look at a grave, that wasn't something a ruling fixed. That was something a person carried and learned to set down when they could and picked back up when they had to. She thought about that sometimes, about the difference between resolution and repair, about how the stories we tell about justice tend to end at the ruling, because the ruling is where the narrative has a shape, and what comes after is just life, which is harder to narrate because it doesn't build toward anything except more of itself. She thought Holt would have understood that. He'd spent 40 years living after various resolutions, building the same thing back up whenever it got knocked down. Not because he believed the building couldn't be knocked down again, but because he believed the building was still worth doing. That was what she'd inherited. Not 31 acres and a tin box and a debt. The belief that the building was worth doing. In May, when the creek was running full and the meadow had come back green and the goats had decided spring was acceptable, Cole asked her to marry him in the most direct and unromantic way imaginable, which was while they were both pulling a stubborn fence post out of ground that had gone soft with snowmelt and arguing about the correct angle of extraction. He just stopped pulling and looked at her and said, I want to ask you something. She was holding her side of the post and breathing hard from the effort. What? Will you marry me? He said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement, somewhere between the way he said most things that mattered. She looked at him across the fence post. He was muddy from the knees down, and there was a smear of clay on his jaw from when he'd wiped his face with the back of his hand. And he was watching her with that level, honest attention that she had come to understand was the way he looked at things he cared about. "Yes," she said. "Help me get this post out first." He helped her get the post out. Then they walked back to the cabin in the mud and the spring air, and Eli was in the goat pen talking to Murph with the seriousness of someone engaged in important ongoing conversation. And the mountain was green and enormous above them, and none of it was what she would have imagined for herself if you'd asked her a year ago what her life would hold. That was the thing she kept returning to, in the quiet hours, in the evenings when the work was done, and the cabin was warm and the three of them were simply in the same space together, each occupied with something small and ordinary. The thing you couldn't have planned for was not the storm, or the man at the door, or the documents in the tin box, or even the hearing in the long bench saloon with the whole territory watching. The thing you couldn't have planned for was the door you opened when you didn't have to. That's what she'd done, in a blizzard, with almost nothing left and no particular reason to trust a stranger. She'd opened the door because the child's eyes were cold, and the man's voice was honest, and she was not the kind of person who could do otherwise. Not because she was good, she was not reliably good. She was stubborn and calculating, and sometimes unkind in the small ways that people who are self-reliant can be unkind without noticing. But she was not the kind of person who left a child in the snow. And that one quality, that single refusal to look away, had set every other thing in motion. You don't get to know, when you open the door, what's standing behind it. You don't get to know what a decision will grow into, what it will require of you, what you'll have to learn about yourself in the process of honoring it. You open the door because it's the right thing, or because you can't not, or because somewhere in the bone-deep arithmetic of who you are, turning away costs more than what you're risking, and then you find out what comes next by living it, one hard practical day at a time. Ivy Rowan had learned this, that the most significant choices rarely feel significant at the moment you make them. They feel like a cold night and a strange man and a child who needs warming up. They feel like a cup of bean soup stretched with water because you don't have enough for more. They feel like stepping back from a door and saying, "Come in." Everything else grows from that. The way everything grows from the small true thing, if you tend it right and don't give up on it when it gets difficult, which it will. It always will. The homestead grew. Cole's trust restructuring was finalized by summer, and the persistent block it created on the board's acquisition activities was not as elegant as resolution, but was real and ongoing and required no further intervention to maintain. Mercer Freight continued operating under its management team, running its routes, honoring its contracts, the way James Mercer had built it to do. And Cole received quarterly reports that he read at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings, and occasionally made notes on and sent back, which was as much involvement as he chose, and which was enough. The Mountain families held their land. Tom Lester's cattle operation turned profitable the following year. Burl Harriman added 2 men to his timber crew. Old Caswell's son came back from wherever he'd been and started working the creekside acreage with his father, and there was something in that particular return that Ivy thought about sometimes, the way a place could be enough to come back to, if it was still there. Harlan Doyle and Ada Pruitt did not become friends. They became something more complicated than friends and less complicated than what they'd been before. Something that had room in it for 35 years of accumulated distance and still functioned, which was its own kind of achievement. Ada brought him biscuits once a month, which she made at a standard she had apparently always been capable of meeting and had simply declined to meet previously. Harlan ate them without comment and refilled her coffee without being asked. That was enough. Silas kept moving through the mountain territory on his loops and angles, stopping at Ivy's place when his route brought him there, drinking 2 cups of coffee and refusing biscuits and occasionally saying something that turned out to be important. He was the first person to visit when Eli started asking, at age 6, whether he could learn to check the trap lines, and Silas looked at the boy for a long moment and said, "You'd have to learn to be quiet for a long time." Eli said, "I can be quiet." Silas looked at Cole. Cole shrugged, with the expression of a man who had learned that his son's competence was reliable. Silas took him on the next loop, and Eli came back muddy and exhausted and more contented than she'd ever seen him, and that was the beginning of something that would last. The cabin that Holt Rowan had built 40 years ago, that had been falling slowly into disrepair for the last few years of his life, and the 8 months of Ivy's alone became in the years following something that looked like what it had always been trying to be. Not perfect. The south wall still ran cold in deep winter no matter what they stuffed into the gap, and the barn roof they rebuilt properly didn't quite match the original pitch. And there were seasons when the creek ran too low and seasons when it ran too high, and neither was what you'd have chosen. But it was solid, and it was warm, and it was full. In the evenings, when the work was done and the light went golden over the western ridge, and the goats were settled and Eli was wherever Eli was with whatever animal currently had his attention, Ivy would sometimes stand on the porch of the cabin that had sheltered two strangers in a blizzard and look out at the mountain and think, this is what you get sometimes if you open the door. Not the life you planned, not the one you were managing toward, carefully, alone, with your calculations and your tin box and your stubborn refusal to let the margins win. Something better. Something that required more of you and gave back more than what you put in, which is the only kind of arithmetic that ever really matters. The door was still the same door. She'd never replaced it. She didn't intend to.